Yes, now it
Okay.
is.
It is being live streamed. Got it.
It says it's setting up the meeting for YouTube live.
Yes.
Hey everyone, if we look like we just breathed a sigh of relief, it is because this is take 2. Technical difficulties were all my fault. Everyone who has spoken thus far has done great, and we got to see it, but you did not. So welcome to our first actual live stream. This is going to be chapters 1 through 5 of Jane Eyre as part of our Jane Eyre Readathon. Our goal today is to raise awareness and also funds about the Hanrisfield Library and all of its treasures that we're hoping to save. If you've seen the news, you may have heard that the Hanrisfield Library is a collection of 19th century documents, manuscripts, books relating to pretty much any famous author you can think of from that time period. These have been kept in a private collection. They have not been available to scholars or the public for nearly 100 years. And these were set to go to public auction at Sotheby's in July and basically go to the highest bidder. If you know about how museums work and how they've had to handle the pandemic, you can probably imagine that museums and libraries would not be the highest bidders at a time like this. It would most likely happen that the items would return to private collections. Thankfully, the auction at Sotheby's was put on hold thanks to a coalition of libraries and museums called the Friends of the National Libraries. This organization has been given the opportunity to purchase these items for public display for £15 million. Yes, that is a lot of money, and that is why we're here today. We're trying to raise funds to help contribute to the Friends of the National Libraries so they can purchase these items. If you would like to donate, there are links available in our previous YouTube videos. Below the welcome video, there are links to donate to our GoFundMe page and also directly to the Friends of the National Libraries. If you are in Britain, donating directly to the Friends of the National Libraries is probably in your best interest because of tax reasons. If you are in America or elsewhere, donating to our GoFundMe page will probably save you currency conversion fees. So that may be the way to go. All of the money that we're raising with the GoFundMe will be going to the Friends of the National Libraries. We also have a link that will be available later today for our charity auction, where we have bookish items that will be sold from July 3rd to July 10th. If you have something you would like to donate, please look for the form on our Twitter. We are at Bring Brontes Hum, H-O-M without the E. And you can find a link there if you would like to donate something. When we get to July 3rd, we will share links about how you can bid on different items. So our goal today is to raise some funds, but also to have some fun. Those of us here, not all of us are professional actors. We have never met until about 10 minutes before this live stream started. And we are completely unrehearsed. What we're reading off of are scripts that look like this, if it will focus. They are highlighted copies of the novel. I highlighted these, and there is probably going to be some errors throughout where I just failed to highlight some people's parts. If that happened, the actor didn't mess up, I did. So I do take full responsibility for that. We are going to do our best with this, but please be patient. Everyone, I hope that you are ready. We're going to have fun with this. If not, then I hope people at least enjoy laughing at our discomfort and then feel sorry enough to donate some money to help save the treasures. I should mention too that one of the treasures in the Hanrisfield Library is featured in the chapters that we're reading. It is the Bronte family's copy of Bewick's A History of British Birds. It's something that you'll see in a moment Jane reads as comfort. The Bronte family did have an annotated copy of this in which their father, Patrick, explained which birds were edible and which ones were not in his margin notes. So stay tuned for that. When we read that, you can just know that maybe in a couple of years, you can go see that on display at the Bronte Parsonage Museum and then say that you helped get it there. We're going to introduce our readers now. Everyone, please say your name, where you're from, anything you want to share. And Alice, you are up first. You're on mute.
Hey, my name is Alice Bloomer. I am calling in from East Sussex in England. I'm really excited to take part in this, mostly because I believe that literature and art belongs to the public, not in private hands. So if you can, please donate. I'm a huge believer in this cause. Thank you very much. And thank you, Amber, for pulling this together.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Corey, can you please tell us a bit about yourself?
Hi, I'm Corey Anderson. I am an actor and bakery owner in Atlanta, Georgia. And like Alice and Amber and everyone else here, I have had a love for literature and the arts since the time I was born. And so I am so thrilled to get to be part of this reading and get to re-experience Jane Eyre.
Thank you. Matt, can you please go next?
Sure. My name is Matt Midget. I'm an improviser based in Orlando, Florida. And so others laughing at my discomfort has kind of been my entire career. This is actually my very first experience with Jane Eyre, as it was not something that I read in school. And I am fascinated by it so far.
Oh, that's great. I am aware that there are probably a lot of people tuning in who don't know about the book. So that's why I ask for no spoilers. I accidentally spoiled a big plot twist with one of our actors because I thought she had read it, not one of you, a later actor, and she had not, and I feel bad about it. So let's keep this fresh for everyone who doesn't know what's going on and not tell them who dies and who doesn't. So Rachel, can you please tell us a bit about you?
Hi, I'm Rachel Maria Bell. I live in Scarborough in England, and I've got my childhood copy of Jane Eyre sitting beside me today. Yeah, and I am definitely not an actor, so do expect, mess ups or whatever. But thank you so much, Amber, for organising this. Can't wait.
Thank you. And thank you for representing Yorkshire too. And I know that you're close to Anne Bronte's grave, which is fantastic. If you are in the greater England, or I guess Northern English area at any time, go check out Anne's grave in addition to Haworth, because it's really beautiful there. Okay, Jill, you're up next.
Hi, I'm Jill Dickinson. I'm in Austin, Texas. I'm a big reader, but I've never read Jane Eyre before, so I'm super excited. I get to read today and tomorrow. So I really want to thank Amber for including me in this. This is awesome.
Thank you so much. And Carolina, can you please tell us about yourself?
Hey there, my name is Carolina Succi. I'm from the south of Argentina. I'm a teacher of various things, mainly Spanish and literature. And like our Janes have already said, we're all here because we love literature. I've read Wuthering Heights and The Tenant of Awful Hall once a year since I was like 16. We're not going to discuss how long ago that was. But like Alice has said, these items should not be in private collections. They should be open and available to the public so that this is cultural patrimony. I'm not quite sure the word right there, but this is something that belongs to a museum. So I'm really excited. I'm very proud to be a part of this, and I hope we can achieve our goal.
Thank you. And I am Amber Elby. I'm going to be here for every session today, either as the host or as a participant or both. And I am an author in Austin, Texas. I'm also a professor and a huge Bronte fangirl. When one of my friends woke me up at 7 in the morning with a text with the announcement that the Honresfield Library existed and was going up for public auction, I started bawling all day. I did not stop, because the idea of being able to see Emily's miniature book is just a lot for me. And like, even just thinking about it now, I'm starting to cry. So I really can't wait for these treasures to be saved and to be able to go and see them in a museum at some point. So we are going to go ahead and begin If you have to step away, don't worry, because all of this is going to be recorded on YouTube. Our next session starts at 1 o'clock in New York, which is 6 o'clock in London. So come back for that as well. We're going to start with the preface to Jane Eyre. So this is the part that is Charlotte's own voice. And Carolina, can you please start us out with that?
Indeed. Preface. A preface to the first edition of Jane Eyre being unnecessary, I gave none. The second edition demands a few words, both acknowledgement and miscellaneous remark. My thanks are due in 3 quarters. To the public, for the indulgent ear it has inclined to a plain tale with few pretensions. To the press, for the fair field its honest suffrage has opened to an obscure aspirant. To my publishers, for the aid their tact, their energy, their practical sense, and frank liberality have afforded an unknown and unrecommended author. The present public are but vague personifications for me, and I must thank them in vague terms, but my publishers are definite. So are certain generous critics who have encouraged me, as only large-hearted and high-minded men know how to encourage a struggling stranger. To them, i.e. to my publishers, and the select reviewers, I say cordially, gentlemen, I thank you from my heart. Having thus acknowledged what I owe those who have aided and approved me, I turn to another class, a small one, so far as I know, but not, therefore, to be overlooked. I mean the timorous or carping few who doubt the tendency of such books as Jane Eyre, in whose eyes whatever is unusual is wrong, whose ears detect in each protest against bigotry, that parent of crime, an insult to piety, that regent of God on earth. I would suggest to such doubters certain obvious distinctions. I will remind them of certain simple truths. Conventionality is not morality. Self-righteousness is not religion. To attack the first is not to assail the last. To pluck the mask from the face of the Pharisee is not to lift an impious hand to the crown of thorns. These things and deeds are diametrically opposed. They are as distinct as is vice from virtue. Men too often confound them. They should not be confounded. Appearance should not be mistaken for truth. Narrow human doctrines that only tend to elate and magnify a few should not be substituted for the world-redeeming creed of Christ. There is, I repeat it, a difference, and it is a good and not a bad action to mark broadly and clearly the line of separation between them. The world may not like to see these ideas dissevered, for it has been accustomed to blend them, finding it convenient to make external show pass for sterling worth, to let whitewashed walls vouch for clean shrines. It may hate him who dares to scrutinize and expose, to raise the gilding and show base metal under it, to penetrate the sepulchre and reveal charnel relics. But hate as it will, it is indebted to him. Ahab did not like Micaiah, because he never prophesied good concerning him, but evil. Probably he liked the sycophant son of Hineena better. Yet might Ahab have escaped a bloody death, had he but stopped his ears to flattery and opened them to faithful counsel. There is a man in our days whose words are not framed to tickle delicate ears, who, to my thinking, comes before the great ones of society, much as the son of Imlah came before the throned kings of Judah and Israel, and who speaks truth as deep, with a power as prophet-like and as vital, a mien as dauntless and as daring. Is the satirist of Vanity Fair admired in high places? I cannot tell, but I think if some of those amongst whom he hurls the Greek fire of his sarcasm, and over whom he flashes the leaden brand of his denunciation, were to take his warnings in time, they or their seed might yet escape a fatal Ramoth Gilead. Why have I alluded to this man? I have alluded to him, reader, because I think I see in him an intellect profounder and more unique than his contemporaries have yet recognized, because I regard him as the first social regenerator of the day, as the very master of that working corpse who will restore to rectitude the warped system of things. Because I think no commentator of his writings has yet found the comparison that suits him, the terms which rightly characterize his talents. They say he is like Fielding. They talk of his wit, humor, comic powers. He resembles Fielding as an eagle does a vulture. Fielding could stoop on carrion, but Thackeray never does. His wit is bright, his humor attractive, but both bear the same relation to his serious genius that the mere lambent sheet lightning playing under the edge of the summer cloud does to the electric death spark hid in its womb. Finally, I have alluded to Mr. Thackeray because to him, if he will accept the tribute of a total stranger, I have dedicated this second edition of Jane Eyre. Currer Bell, December 21st, 1847. Note to the third edition. I avail myself of the opportunity which a third edition of Jane Eyre affords me of again addressing a word to the public, to explain that my claim to the title of novelist rests on this one work alone. If, therefore, the authorship of other works of fiction has been attributed to me, an honor is awarded where it is not merited, and consequently denied where it is justly due. This explanation will serve to rectify mistakes which may already have been made and to prevent future errors. Currer Bell, April 13th, 1848.
Fantastic, thank you. And if you want to clap like we usually do on Zoom, this is clapping. So thank you so much for reading that. Those are such powerful words coming from the author of this fantastic novel, who wasn't even able to publish the original editions in her own name, which makes Jane's words so much more powerful that we get to hear a strong female voice saying the things that Jane does. So thank you. Actors, we're about to start with the novel. If you want to turn off your video at any time, feel free to. If you'd rather leave it on, that's fine as well. In my screen, when I have my video off, it will show you the link to our GoFundMe page, and you can click on the link in the welcome video in our YouTube channel as well. So whenever you're ready, Alice Bloomer, please unmute yourself and go ahead and start. And by the way, everyone too, actors do have pets and family members who are presumably in the rooms with them. So if you ever see them looking to the side, it's probably for a cute dog. Okay, go ahead and start, Alice. Thank you.
Thank you. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. We had been wandering, indeed, in the leafless shrubbery an hour in the morning, but since dinner, Mrs. Reed, when there was no company, dined early. The cold winter wind had brought with it clouds so somber and a rain so penetrating that further outdoor exercise was now out of the question. I was glad of it. Never liked long walks, especially on chilly afternoons. Dreadful to me was the coming home in the raw twilight with nipped fingers and toes, and a heart saddened by the childings of Bessie, the nurse, and humbled by the consciousness of my physical inferiority to Eliza, John, and Georgiana Reed. The said Eliza, John, and Georgiana were now clustered round their mamma in a drawing room. She reclined on a sofa by the fireside, and, with her darlings about her, for the time neither quarrelling nor crying, looked perfectly happy. Me, she had dispensed from joining the group, saying she regretted to be under the necessity of keeping me at a distance, but that until she heard from Bessie and could discover by her own observation that I was endeavouring in good earnest to acquire a more sociable and childlike disposition, a more attractive and sprightly manner, something lighter, franker, more natural, as it were, she really must exclude me from privileges intended for only contented, happy little children.
What does Bessie say I have done?
Jane, I don't like cavillers or questioners. Besides, there is something truly forbidding in a child taking up her elders in that manner. Be seated somewhere, and until you can speak pleasantly, remain silent.
A breakfast room adjoined the drawing room. I signed in there. It contained a bookcase. I soon possessed myself of a volume, taking care that it should be one stored with pictures. I mounted it into the window seat, gathering up my feet. I sat cross-legged like a Turk, and having drawn the red moreen curtain nearly close, I was shrined in double retirement. Folds of scarlet drapery shut in my view to the right hand. To the left were clear panes of glass, protecting but not separating me from the drear November day. At intervals, while turning over the leaves of my book, I studied the aspect of that winter afternoon. Afar, it offered a pale blank of mist and cloud, the air scene of wet lawn and storm-beat shrub, with ceaseless rain sweeping away wildly before a long and lamentable blast. I returned to my book. Bewick's History of British Birds. The letterpress thereof I cared little for, generally speaking, and yet there was a certain introductory pages that, child as I was, I could not pass quite as a blank. There were those which treat of the haunts of seafowl, of the solitary rocks and promontories by them only inhabited, of the coast of Norway, studded with isles from its southern extremity, the Lindness or Naze, to the North Cape. Where the North Ocean in vast worlds boils round the naked, melancholy isles of farthest Thule, and the Atlantic surge pours in the stormy Hebrides. Nor could I pass unnoticed the suggestion of bleak shores of Lapland, Siberia, Spitsbergen, Nova Scotia, Zembla, Iceland, Greenland, with the vast sweep of the Arctic zone and those forlorn regions of dreary space, the reservoir of frost and snow, where firm fields of ice and accumulation of centuries of winters glazed in alpine heights above heights surrounded the pole and concentrate the multiplied rigors of extreme cold, of those death-white realms, I formed an idea of my own. Shadowy, like all the half-comprehended notions that float dim through children's brains, but strangely impressive. The words in these introductory pages connected themselves with the surrounding vignettes and gave significance to the rock, standing up alone in a sea of billow and spray, to the broken boat stranded on a desolate coast, to the cold and ghastly moon glancing through bars of cloud at a wreck just sinking. I cannot tell what sentiment haunted the quiet, solitary churchyard with its inscribed headstone at its gate. Its two trees, its low horizon girdled by a broken wall, and its newly risen crescent attesting the hour of eventide. The two ships becalmed on a torpid sea, I believed to be marine phantoms. The fiend pinning down the thief's pack behind him, I passed over quickly. It was an object of terror. So was a black-horned thing seated aloof a rock, surveying a distant crowd surrounding a gallows. Each picture told a story, mysterious often to my undeveloped understanding and imperfect feelings, yet ever profoundly interesting as the tales Bessie sometimes narrated on winter evenings when she chanced to be in good humour, and when, having brought her ironing table to the nursery hearth, she allowed us to sit about it, and while she got up, Mrs. Reed's lace frills and crimped her nightcap Mrs. Reed's lace frills and crimped her nightcap fed our eager attention with passages of love and adventure taken from old fairy tales and other ballads, or, as at a later period I discovered, from the pages of Pamela and Henry, Earl of Morland. With Berwick on my knee, I was then happy at least in my way. I feared nothing but interruption, and that came too soon. The breakfast room door opened.
"Oh, Madam Mope!"
cried the voice of John Reed. Then he paused. He found the room apparently empty.
"Where the dickens is she? Lizzie, Georgie, Joan is not here. Tell Mama she has run out into the rain. Bad animal."
It is well I drew the curtain,
thought I, and wished fervently he might not discover my hiding place. Nor would John Reed have found out himself. He was not quick either of vision or conception, but Eliza put her head at the door and said at once,
"She's in the window seat, to be sure, Jack."
As I came out immediately, for I trembled at the idea of being dragged forth by the said Jack.
What do you want?
I asked with awkward diffidence.
Say, what do you want, Master Reed? I want you to come here.
And seating himself in an armchair, he intimidated by a gesture that I was to approach and stand before him. John Reed was a schoolboy of 14 years old, 4 years older than I, for I was but 10, large and stout for his age, with a dingy and wholesome skin, thick lineaments in a spacious visage, heavy limbs and large extremities. He gorged himself habitually at table, which made him bilious and gave him a dim and bleared eye, and had taken him home for a month or two on account of his delicate health. Mr. Miles, the master, affirmed that he would do very well if he had fewer cakes and sweetmeats sent him from home, but the mother, heart turned from an opinion so harsh, and inclined rather to the more refined idea that John's sallowness was owing to his over-application and perhaps to pining after home. John had not much affection for his mother and sisters and an antipathy to me. He bullied and punished me, not 2 or 3 times in the week, nor once or twice in the day, but continually. Every nerve I had feared him, and every morsel of flesh in my bones shrank when he came near. There were moments when I was bewildered by the terror he inspired, because I had no appeal whatever against either his menaces or his inflictions. The servants did not like to offend their young master by taking part against him, and Mrs. Reed was blind and deaf on the subject. She never saw him strike or heard him abuse me, though he did both now and then in her very presence, more frequently, however, behind her back. Habitually obedient to John, I came up to his chair. He spent some 3 minutes in thrusting out his tongue at me far as he could without damaging the roots. I knew he would soon strike, and while dreading the blow, I mused on the disgusting and ugly appearance of him who would presently deal it. I wonder if he read the notion in my face, for all at once, without speaking, he struck suddenly and strongly. I tottered on, and, regaining my equilibrium, retired back a step or 2 from his chair.
That is for your impudence in answering Mama a while since, and for your sneaking way of getting behind curtains, and for the look you had in your eyes 2 minutes since, you rat.
Accustomed to John Reed's abuse, I never had an idea of replying to it. My care was how to endure the blow which would certainly follow the insult.
What were you doing behind the curtain?
I was reading.
Show the book.
I returned to the window and fetched it thence.
You have no business to take our books. You are a dependent, Mama says. You have no money. Your father left you none. You ought to beg and not live here with gentlemen's children like us, and eat the same meals we do and wear clothes at our mama's expense. Now, I'll teach you to rummage my bookshelves, for they are mine. All the house belongs to me, or will do in a few years. Go and stand by the door, out of the way of the mirror and the windows.
I did so, not at first aware what was his intention, but when I saw him lift and poise the book and stand in action to hurl it, I instinctively started aside with a cry of alarm. Not soon enough, however, the volume was flung. It hit me, and I fell, striking my head against the door and cutting it. The cut bled. The pain was sharp. My terror had passed its climax. Other feelings succeeded.
Wicked and cruel boy. You are like a murderer. You're like a slave driver. You are like the Roman emperors.
I had read Goldsmith's History of Rome and formed my opinion of Nero, Caligula, and etc., and also drawn parallels in silence which I never thought thus to have declared aloud.
What? What? Did she say that to me? Did you hear her, Eliza and Georgiana? Won't I tell Mama? But first...
He ran headlong at me. I felt him grasp my hair and my shoulder. He had closed with a desperate thing. I really saw in him a tyrant, a murderer. I felt a drop or 2 of blood from my head trickle down my neck, and was sensible of somewhat pungent suffering. These sensations for the time predominated over fear, and I received him in a frantic sort. I don't very well know what I did with my hands, but he called me rat, rat, and bellowed out aloud. Aid was near him. Eliza and Georgiana had run from Mrs. Reed, who was gone upstairs. She now came upon the scene, followed by Bessie and her maid Abbott. We were parted. I heard the words,
Dear, dear, what a fury to fly at Master John.
Did ever anybody see a picture of such passion?
Then Mrs. Reed subjoined,
Take her away to the Red Room and lock her in there.
4 hands were immediately laid upon me, and I was borne upstairs. Chapter 2. I resisted all the way. A new thing for me, and a circumstance which greatly strengthened the bad opinion Bessie and Miss Abbott were disposed to entertain of me. The fact is, I was a trifle beside myself, or rather out of myself, as the French would say. I was conscious that a moment's mutiny had already rendered me liable to strange penalties, and, like any other rebel slave, I felt resolved, in my desperation, to go all lengths.
Hold her arms, Miss Abbott. She's like a mad cat.
For shame, for shame. What shocking conduct, Miss Eyre, to strike a young gentleman, your benefactress's son, your young master.
Master? How is he my master? Am I a servant?
No, you are. Oh, is that me?
That was you. Sorry. Go ahead, Abbott.
No, you are less than a servant, for you do nothing for your keep. There, sit down and think over your wickedness.
They had got me by this time into the apartment indicated by Mrs. Reed, and had thrust me upon a stool. My impulse was to rise from it like a spring. Their 2 pair of hands arrested me instantly.
If you don't sit still, you must be tied down. Miss Abbott, lend me your garters. She would break mine directly.
Miss Abbott turned to divest a stout leg of necessary ligature. This preparation for bonds, and the additional ignominy it inferred, took a little of the excitement out of me.
Don't take them off. I will not stir.
In guarantee whereof I attached myself to my seat by my hands.
Mind you don't.
And when she had ascertained that I was really subsiding, she loosened her hold of me. Then she and Miss Abbott stood with folded arms, looking darkly and doubtfully on my face, as incredulous of my sanity.
She never did so before.
At last, said Bessie, turning to the Abigail.
But it was always in her. I've told Mrs. often my opinion about the child, and Mrs. agreed with me. She's an underhand little thing. I never saw a girl of her age with so much cover.
Bessie answered not, but ere long, addressing me, she said,
You ought to be aware, miss, that you are under obligations to Mrs. Reed. She keeps you. If she were to turn you off, you would have to go to the poorhouse.
I had nothing to say to these words. They were not new to me. My very first recollections of existence included hints of the same kind. The reproach of my dependence had become a vague sing-song in my ear, very painful and crushing, but only half intelligible. Miss Abbott joined in.
And you ought not to think yourself on an equality with the Mrs. Reed and Master Reed, because Mrs. kindly allows you to be brought up with them. They will have a great deal of money, and you will have none. It is your place to be humble and to try to make yourself agreeable to them.
What we tell you is for your good.
Added Betty in no harsh voice.
You should try to be useful and pleasant then. Perhaps you would have a home here. But if you become passionate and rude, Mrs. will send you away, I am sure.
Besides, God will punish her. He might strike her dead in the midst of her tantrums, and then where would she go? Come, Bessie, we will leave her. I wouldn't have her heart for anything. Say your prayers, Miss Eyre, when you are by yourself. For if you don't repent, something bad might be permitted to come down the chimney and fetch you away.
They went, shutting the door and locking it behind them. The Red Room was a square chamber, very seldom slept in. I might say never indeed, unless when a chance influx of visitors at Gateshead Hall rendered it necessary to turn to account all the accommodation it contained. Yet it was one of the largest stateliest chambers in the mansion. A bed supported on the massive pillars of mahogany, hung with curtains of deep red damask, stood out like a tabernacle in the centre. The two large windows, with their blinds always drawn down, were half shrouded in festoons and folds of similar drapery. The carpet was red. The table at the foot of the bed was covered with a crimson cloth. The walls were a soft fawn colour, with a blush of pink in the wardrobe. The toilet table, the chairs, were of darkly polished old mahogany. Out of these deep surrounding shades rose high and glared white the piled-up mattresses and pillows of the bed, spread with a snowy Marseille counterpane. Scarcely less prominent was an ample cushioned easy chair near the head of the bed, also white, with a footstool before it, and looking, as I thought, like a pale throne. This room was chill, because it seldom had a fire. It was silent, because remote from the nursery and the kitchen. Solemn, because it was known to be seldom entered. The housemaid alone came here on Saturdays to wipe from the mirrors and the furniture a week's quiet dust. And Mrs. Reed herself, at far intervals, visited to review the contents of a certain secret drawer in the wardrobe where were stored divers parchments, her jewel casket, and a miniature of her deceased husband. And in those last words lies the secrets of the Red Room, the spell which kept it so lonely in spite of its grandeur. Mr. Reed had been dead 9 years. It was in this chamber he breathed his last. Here he lay in state, hence his coffin was borne by the undertaker men. And since that day, a sense of dreary consecration had guarded it from frequent intrusion. My seat, to which Bessie and the bitter Miss Abbott had left me riveted, was a low ottoman near the marble chimney-piece. The bed rose before me. To my right hand there was the high, dark wardrobe with subdued, broken reflections varying the gloss of its panels. To my left were the muffled windows. A great-looking glass between them repeated the vacant majesty of the bedroom. I was not quite sure whether they had locked the door, and when I dared move, I got up and went to see. Alas, yes, no jail was ever more secure. Returning, I had to cross before the looking-glass. My fascinated glance involuntarily explored the depth it revealed. All looked colder and darker in that visionary hollow than in reality, and the strange little figure there gazing at me with a white face and arms specking the gloom and glittering eyes of fear moving where all else was still had the effect of a real spirit. I thought it like one of the tiny phantoms, half fairy, half imp. Bessie's evening stories represented as coming out of lone, ferny dells and moors and appearing before the eyes of belated travellers. I returned to my stool. Superstition was with me at that moment, but it was not yet her hour for complete victory. My blood was still warm. The mood of the revolted slave was still bracing me with its bitter vigour. I had to stem a rapid rush of retrospective thought before I quailed to the dismal present. All John Reed's violent tyrannies, all his sister's proud indifference, and all his mother's aversion, all the servants' partiality, turned up in my disturbed mind like a dark deposit in a turbid well. Why was I always suffering, always browbeaten, always accused, forever condemned? Why could I never please? Why was it useless to try to win anyone's favor? Eliza, who was headstrong and selfish, was respected. Georgiana, who had a spoiled temper, a very acrid spite, a captious and insolent carriage, was universally indulged. Her beauty, her pink cheeks and golden curls seemed to give delight to all who looked at her, and to purchase indemnity for every fault. John, no one thwarted, much less punished, though he twisted the necks of the pigeons, killed the little pea-chicks, set the dogs at the sheep, stripped the hothouse vines of their fruit, and broke the buds of the choicest plants in the conservatory. He called his mother old girl, too, sometimes, reviled her for her dark skin, similar to his own, bluntly disregarded her wishes, not unfrequently tore and spoiled her silk attire, and he was still her own darling. I dared commit no fault. I strove to fulfill every duty, and I was termed naughty and tiresome, sullen and sneaking from morning to noon and from noon to night. My head still ached and bled with the blow I had and the fall I had received. No one had reproved John for wantonly striking me, and because I had turned against him to avert farther irrational violence, I was loaded with general opprobrium. Unjust, unjust, said my reason, forced by the agonizing stimulus into precocious through transitory power and resolve, equally wrought up, instigated some strange expedient to achieve escape from insuperable oppression, as running away, or, if that could not be effected, never eating or drinking more, and letting myself die. What a consternation of soul was mine that dreary afternoon! How all my brain was in tumult and all my heart in insurrection. Yet in what darkness, what dense ignorance was the mental battle fought? I could not answer the ceaseless inward question, why I thus suffered, now at the distance of, I will not say how many years, I see it clearly. I was at a discord in Gateshead Hall. I was like nobody there. I had nothing in harmony with Mrs. Reed or her children, or her chosen vassalage. If they did not love me, in fact, as little as I did love them, they were no bound to regard with affection a thing that could not sympathize with one amongst them, a heterogeneous thing opposed to them in temperament, in capacity, in propensities, a useless thing, incapable of serving their interest or adding to their pleasure, a noxious thing cherishing the germs of indignation at their treatment, of contempt of their judgment. I know that I had been a sanguine, brilliant, careless, exacting, handsome, romping child, though equally dependent and friendless. Mrs. Reed would have endured my presence more complacently. Her children would have entertained for me more of the cordiality of fellow feeling. The servants would have been less prone to make me the scapegoat of the nursery. Daylight began to forsake the Red Room. It was past 4 o'clock, and the bed-clouded afternoon was tending to drear twilight. I heard the rain still beating continuously on the staircase window, and the wind howling on the grove behind the hall. I grew by degrees cold as a stone, and then my courage sank. My habitual mood of humiliation, self-doubt, forlorn depression fell damp on the embers of my decaying ire. All said I was wicked, and perhaps I might be so. What thought had I been just conceiving of starving myself to death? That certainly was a crime, and was I fit to die? Or was the vault under the chancel of the Gateshead Church inviting bourne? In such vault, I had been told, did Mr. Reed lie buried, and led by this thought to recall his idea. I dwelt on it with gathering dread. I could not remember him, but knew he was my own uncle, my mother's brother, that he had taken me when a parentless infant into his house, and that in his last moments he required a promise of Mrs. Reed that she would rear and maintain me as one of her own children. Mrs. Reed probably considered that she had kept this promise. And so she had, I dare say, as well as her nature would permit her. But how could she really like an interloper, not of her race, and unconnected with her after her husband's death by any tie? It must have been most irksome to find herself bound by a hard-wrung pledge to stand in the stead of a parent to a strange child she could not love, and to see an uncongenial alien permanently intruded on her own family group. A singular notion dawned upon me. I doubted not, nor never doubted that if Mr. Reed had been alive, he would have treated me kindly. And now, as I sat looking at the white bed and overshadowed walls, occasionally also turning a fascinated eye towards the dimly gleaming mirror, I began to recall what I had heard of dead men troubled in their graves by the vision of their last wishes revisiting the earth to punish the perjured and avenge the oppressed. And I thought Mr. Reed's spirit, harassed by the wrongs of his sister's child, might quit its abode, whether in the church vault or in the unknown world of the departed, and rise before me in this chamber. I wiped my tears and hushed my sobs, fearful lest any sign of violent grief might waken the preternatural voice to comfort me, or elicit from the gloom some haloed force bending over me with strange piety. This idea, consolatory in theory, I felt would be terrible if realized. With all might I endeavored to stifle it. I endeavored to be firm. Shaking my hair from my eyes, I lifted my head and tried to look boldly round the dark room. At this moment, a light gleamed on the wall. Was it, I asked myself, a ray from the moon penetrating some aperture to the blind? No, moonlight was still, and this stirred while I gazed. It glided up the ceiling and quivered over my head. I can now conjecture readily that this streak of light was, in all likelihood, a gleam from a lantern carried by someone across the lawn, but then, prepared as my mind was for horror, shaken as my nerves were by agitation, I thought the swift darting beam was a herald of some coming vision from another world. My heart beat thick. My head grew hot, a sound filling my ears, which I deemed the rushing of wings. Something seemed near me. I was oppressed, suffocated. Endurance broke down. I rushed to the door and shook the lock in desperate effort. Steps come running along the passage. The key turned and Bessie Abbott entered.
Miss Eyre, are you ill?
What a dreadful noise. It went quite through me.
Take me out. Let me go into the nursery.
What for? Are you hurt? Have you seen something?
I saw a light. I thought a ghost would come.
I had now got hold of Bessie's hand, and she did not snatch it from me.
She has screamed out on purpose,
declared Abbott in some disgust.
And what a scream. If she had been in great pain, one would have excused it. But she only wanted to bring us all here. I know her naughty tricks.
What is all this?
Demanded another voice prematurely, and Mrs. Reed came along the corridor, her cap flying wide, her gown rustling stormily.
Can you continue there, Mrs. Reed, please?
Who?
It's not highlighted, so Mrs. Reed, can you please go with Abbott and Bessie?
Abbott and Bessie, I believe I gave the orders that Jane Eyre should be left in the Red Room till I came to her myself.
Miss Jane screamed so loud, ma'am,
was the only answer.
Loose Bessie's hand, child. You cannot succeed in getting out by these means, be assured. I abhor artifice, particularly in children. It is my duty to show you that tricks will not answer. You will now stay here an hour longer, and it is only on condition of perfect submission and stillness that I shall liberate you then.
Oh, Aunt, have pity, forgive me. I cannot endure it. Let me be punished some other way. I shall be killed if I...
Silence! This violence is almost repulsive.
And so, no doubt, she felt it. I was a precocious actress in her eyes. So she sincerely looked on me as a compound of virulent passions, mean spirit, and a dangerous duplicity. Bessie and Abbott, having retreated, Mrs. Reed, impatient of my now frantic anguish and wild sobs, abruptly thrust me back and locked me in without farther parley. I heard her sweeping away, and soon after she was gone, I suppose I had a species of fit unconsciousness and closed the scene. Chapter 3. The next thing I remember is waking up with a feeling as if I had had a frightful nightmare and seeing before me a terrible red glare crossed with thick black bars. I heard voices too, speaking with a hollow sound as if muffled by a rush of wind or water. Agitation, uncertainty, and an all-predominating sense of terror confused my faculties. Ere long, I became aware that someone was handling me, lifting me up and supporting me in a sitting posture, and that more tenderly than I had ever been raised or upheld before, I rested my head against a pillow or an arm and felt easy. In 5 minutes more, the cloud of bewilderment dissolved. I knew quite well that I was in my own bed, and the red glare was the nursery fire. It was night. A candle burnt on the table. Where did I go? In
Bessie
5
stood-
minutes, I knew quite well I was. Bessie stood at the bed foot with a basin in her hand, and a gentleman sat in a chair near my pillow, leaning over me. I felt an inexpressible sense of relief, a soothing conviction of protection and security, when I knew that there was a stranger in the room, an individual not belonging to Gateshead, not related to Mrs. Reed. Turning from Bessie, though her presence was far less obnoxious to me than that of Abbott, for instance, would have been, I scrutinized the face of the gentleman. I knew him as Mr. Lloyd, an apothecary, sometimes called in by Mrs. Reed when the servants were ailing herself and the children she employed a physician.
Well, who am I?
I pronounced his name, offering him at the same time my hand. He took it smiling and saying,
We shall do very well by and by.
Then he laid me down and, addressing Bessie, charged her to be very careful and that I was not disturbed during the night. Having given some further directions and intimated that he should call again the next day, he departed, to my grief. I felt so sheltered and befriended while he sat in the chair near my pillow, and he closed the door after him. All the room darkened, and my heart sank. Inexpressible sadness weighed it down.
Do you feel as if you should sleep, miss?
Asked Bessie, rather softly. Scarcely dared I answer her, for I feared the next sentence might be rough.
I will try.
Would you like to drink, or could you eat anything?
No, thank you, Bessie.
Then I think I shall go to bed, for it is past 12 o'clock, but you may call me if you want anything in the night.
Wonderful civility, this. It emboldened me to ask a question.
Bessie, what is the matter with me? Am I ill?
You fell sick, I suppose, in the red room with crying. You'll be better soon, no doubt.
Bessie went into the housemaid's apartment, which I was near. I heard her say,
Sarah, come and sleep with me in the nursery. I daren't for my life be alone with a poor child tonight. She might die. It's such a strange thing she would have a fit. I wonder if she saw anything. Mrs. was rather too harsh.
Sarah came back with her. They both went to bed. They were whispering together for half an hour before they fell asleep. I caught scraps of their conversation from which I was able only too distinctly to infer the main subject discussed.
Something passed her, all dressed in white, and vanished.
A great black dog behind him.
3 loud raps on the chamber door.
A light in the churchyard just over his grave.
Etc., etc. At last, both slept. The fire and the candle went out. For me, the watches of that long night passed in ghastly wakefulness. Ear, eye, and mind were alike strained by dread, such dread as children only can feel. No severe or prolonged bodily illness followed this incident of the Red Room. It only gave my nerves a shock, of which I feel the reverberation to this day. Yes, Mrs. Reed, to you I owe some fearful pangs of mental suffering. But I ought to forgive you, for you knew not what you did. While rendering my heartstrings, you thought you were only uprooting my bad propensities. Next day, by noon, I was up and dressed, and sat wrapped in a shawl by the nursery hearth. I felt physically weak and broken down, but my worst ailment was an unutterable wretchedness of mind, a wretchedness which kept drawing from me with silent tears. No sooner had I wiped one salt drop from my cheek than another followed. Yet, I thought, I ought to be, I ought to have been happy, for none of the Reeds were there. They were all gone out in carriage with their mamma. Abbott, too, was sewing in another room, and Bessie, as she moved hither and thither, putting away toys and arranging drawers, addressed to me every now and then a word of unwonted kindness. The state of things should have been to me a paradise of peace, accustomed as I was to a life of ceaseless reprimand and thankless fagging. But, in fact, my racked nerves were now in such a state that no calm could soothe and no pleasure excite them agreeably. Bessie had been down to the kitchen, and she brought up with her a tart on a certain brightly painted china plate, whose bird of paradise, nestling in a wreath of convolvuli and rosebuds, had been wont to stir in me a most enthusiastic sense of admiration, and which plate I had often petitioned to be allowed to take in my hand in order to examine it more closely, but had always hitherto been deemed unworthy of such a privilege. This precious vessel was now placed on my knee, and I was cordially invited to eat the circlet of delicate pastry upon it. Vain favour, coming, like most other favours, long deferred and often wished for. Too late. I could not eat the tart, and the plumage of the bird, the tints of the flowers, seemed strangely faded. I put both plate and tart away. Bessie asked if I would have a book. The word book acted as a transient stimulus, and I begged her to fetch Gulliver's Travels from the library. This book I had again and again perused with delight. I considered it a narrative of facts, and discovered it in vain of interest deeper than what I found in fairy tales, for as to the elves, having sought them in vain among foxglove leaves and bells under mushrooms and beneath the ground ivy mantling old walnuts, I had at length made up my mind to the sad truth that they were all gone out of England to some savage country where the woods were wilder and thicker and the population more scant. Whereas Lilliput and Brobdingnag, being in my creed solid parts of the earth's surface, I doubted not that I might one day, by taking a long voyage, see with my own eyes the little fields, houses and trees, the diminutive people, the tiny cows, sheep and birds of the realm, and the cornfields, forest high, the mighty mastiffs, the monster cats, the tower-like men and women of the other. Yet, when this cherished volume was now placed in my hand, when I turned over its leaves and sought in its marvelous pictures the charm I had till now never failed to find, all was eerie and dreary. The giants were gaunt goblins, the pygmies malevolent and fearful imps, Gulliver a most desolate wanderer in most dread and dangerous religions. I closed the book, which I dared no longer peruse, and put it on the table beside the untasted tart. Bessie had now finished dusting and tidying the room, and, having washed her hands, she opened a certain little drawer full of splendid shreds of silk and satin, and began making a new bonnet for Georgiana's doll. Meantime, she sang. Her song was,
"In the days when we went gypsying a long time ago."
I had often heard the song before, and always with lively delight, for Bessie had a sweet voice. At least, I thought so. But now, though her sadness was still sweet, I found in its melody an indescribable sadness. Sometimes, preoccupied with her work, she sang the refrain very lingeringly. A long time ago came out like the saddest cadence of a funeral hymn. She passed into another ballad, this time a really doleful one.
"My feet, they are sore, and my limbs, they are weary. Long is the way, and the mountains are wild. Soon will the twilight close moonless and dreary over the path of the poor orphan child. Why did they send me so far and so lonely? Up where the moors spread and grey rocks are piled, men are hard-hearted and kind angels only watch o'er the steps of a poor orphan child. Yet distant and soft the night breeze is blowing. Clouds there are none, and clear stars beam mild. God in his mercy protection is showing, comfort and hope to the poor orphan child. Even should I fall o'er the broken bridge passing, or stray in the marshes by false lights beguiled, still will my Father with promise and blessing take to his bosom the poor orphan child. There is a thought that for strength should avail me, though both of shelter and kindred despoiled. Heaven is a home, and rest will not fail me. God is a friend to the poor orphan child.
Come, Miss Jane, don't cry,
said Bessie. And she finished. She might as well have said it to the fire. She said to the fire, "Don't burn." But how could she divine the morbid suffering which I was a prey? In the course of the morning, Mr. Lloyd came again. What? Oh.
Already up? Well, nurse, how is she?
Bessie answered that I was doing very well.
Then she ought to look more cheerful. Come here, Miss Jane. Your name is Jane, is it not?
Yes, sir, Jane Eyre.
Well, you have been crying, Miss Jane Eyre. Can you tell me what about? Have you any pain?
No, sir.
Oh, I dare say she is crying because she could not go out with Mrs. McCarriage.
Surely not. Why, she is too old for such pettiness.
I thought so too, and my self-esteem being wounded by the false charge, I answered promptly.
I never cried for such a thing in my life. I hate going out in the carriage. I cry because I am miserable.
Oh, fie, miss.
The good apothecary appeared a little puzzled. I was standing before him. He fixed his eyes on me very steadily. His eyes were small and grey, not very bright, but I dare say I should think them shrewd now. He had a hard-featured yet good-natured looking face. Having considered me at leisure, he said,
"What made you ill yesterday?"
She had a fall,
said Bessie, again putting in her word.
Fall? Why, that is like a baby again. Can't she manage to walk at her age? She must be 8 or 9 years old.
I was knocked down,
Was a blunt explanation jerked out of me by another pang of mortified pride.
but that did not make me ill.
I added, while Mr. Lloyd helped himself to a pinch of snuff. As he was returning the box to his waistcoat pocket, a loud bell rang for the servants' dinner. He knew what it was.
That's for you, nurse. You can go down. I'll give Miss Jane a lecture till you come back.
Bessie would have rather stayed, but she was obliged to go because punctuality at meals was rigidly enforced at Gateshead Hall.
The fall did not make you ill. What did then?
Pursued Mr. Lloyd when Bessie was gone.
I was shut up in a room where there is a ghost till after dark.
I saw Mr. Lloyd smile and frown at the same time.
Ghost? What, you are a baby after all. You're afraid of ghosts.
Of Mr. Reed's ghost I am. He died in that room and was laid out there. Neither Bessie nor anyone else will go into it at night if they can help it. And it was cruel to shut me up alone without a candle. So cruel I think I shall never forget it.
Oh, nonsense. And is this what makes you so miserable? Are you afraid now in daylight?
No, but night will come again before long. Besides, I'm unhappy, very unhappy for other things.
What other things? Can you tell me some of them?
How much I wish to reply fully to this question. How difficult it was to frame any answer. Children can feel, but they cannot analyze their feelings, and if the analysis is partially affected in thought, they know not how to express the result of the process in words. Fearful, however, of losing this first and only opportunity of reliving my grief by imparting it, I, after a disturbed pause, contrived to frame a meager, though, as far as it went, true response.
For one thing, I have no father or mother, brother or sisters.
You have a kind aunt and cousins.
Again, I paused, then bungingly announced,
But John Reed knocked me down, and my aunt shut me up in the Red Room.
Mr. Lloyd, a second time, produced his snuff box.
Don't you think Gateshead Hall a very beautiful house? Are you not thankful to have such a fine place to live at?
It is not my house, sir, and Abbot says I have less right to be here than a servant.
Poof, you can't be silly enough to wish to leave such a splendid place.
If I had anywhere else to go, I should be glad to leave it. But I can never get away from Gateshead Hall till I am a woman.
Perhaps you may. He knows. Have you any relations besides Mrs. Reed?
I think not, sir.
None belonging to your father?
I don't know. I asked Aunt Reed once, and she said possibly I might have some poor, low relations called Eyre, but she knew nothing about them.
If you had such, would you like to go to them?
I reflected. Poverty looks grim to grown people, still more so to children. They have not much idea of industries, working, respectable poverty. They think the world only as connected with ragged clothes, scanty food, fireless grates, rude manners, and debasing voices. Poverty to me was synonymous with degradation.
No, I should not like to belong to poor people.
Not even if they were kind to you?
I shook my head. I could not see how poor people had the means of being kind, and then to learn to speak like them, to adopt their manners, to be uneducated, or to grow up like one of the poor women I saw sometimes nursing their children or washing their clothes at the cottage doors of the village Gateshead. No, I was not heroic enough to purchase liberty at the price of caste.
But are your relatives so very poor? Are they working people?
I cannot tell. Aunt Reed says if I have any, they must be a beggarly set. I should not like to go begging.
Would you like to go to school?
Again, I reflected. I scarcely knew what school was. Bessie sometimes spoke of it as a place where young ladies sat in the stocks, wore backboards, and were exposed to exceedingly genteel and precise. John Reed hated his school and abused his master, but John Reed's tastes were no rule for mine, and if Bessie's accounts of school discipline, gathered from the young ladies of a family where she had lived before coming to Gateshead, were somewhat appalling, her details of certain accomplishments attained by these same young ladies were, I thought, equally attractive. She boasted of beautiful paintings of landscapes and flowers, flowers by them executed, of songs they could sing and pieces they could play, of purses they could net, of French books they could translate, till my spirit was moved to emulation as I listened. Besides, school would be a complete change. It implied a long journey, an entire separation from Gateshead, an entrance into a new life.
I should indeed like to go to school,
was the audible conclusion of my musings.
Well, well, who knows what may happen?
Said Mr. Lloyd as he got up.
The child ought to have a change of air and scene.
He added, speaking to himself.
His nerves not in a good state.
Bessie now returned, as at the same moment the carriage was heard rolling up the gravel walk.
Is that your mistress, nurse? I should like to go speak to her before I go.
Bessie invited him to walk into the breakfast room and led the way out. In the interview which followed between him and Mrs. Reed, I presume from after occurrences that the apothecary ventured to recommend my being sent to school, and the recommendation was no doubt readily enough adopted, for as Abbott said in discussing the subject with Bessie when both sat sewing in the nursery one night after I was in bed and they thought asleep, Mrs. was, she dared say, glad enough to get rid of such tiresome, ill-conditioned child who always looked as if she were watching everybody and scheming plots underhand. Abbott, I think, gave me credit for being short of infantine Guy Fawkes. On that same occasion, I learned for the first time from Miss Abbott's communications to Bessie that my father had been a poor clergyman, that my mother had married him against the wishes of her friends, who considered the match beneath her, that my grandfather, Reade, was so irritated at her disobedience, he cut her off without a shilling, that after my mother and father had been married a year, the latter caught typhus fever while visiting among the poor of a large manufacturing town where his curacy was situated, and where that disease was then prevalent, that my mother took the infection from him, and both died within a month of each other. Bessie, when she heard this narrative, sighed and said,
Poor Miss Jane is to be pitied too, Abbott.
Yes, if she were a nice, pretty child, one might compassionate her forlornness, but one really cannot care for such a little toad as that.
Not a great deal, to be sure. At any rate, a beauty like Miss Georgiana would be more moving in the same condition.
Yes, I dote on Miss Georgiana, little darling, with her long curls and her blue eyes and such a sweet color as she has, just as if she were painted. Bessie, I could fancy a Welsh rabbit for supper.
So could I, with roast onion. Come, we'll go down.
They went. Chapter 4. From my discourse with Mr. Lloyd and from the above reported conference between Bessie and Abbott, I gathered enough of hope to suffice as a motive for wishing to get well. A change seemed near. I desired and waited it in silence. It tarried, however. Days and weeks passed. I had regained my normal state of health, but no new allusion was made to the subject over which I brooded. Mrs. Reade surveyed me at times with a severe eye, but seldom addressed me. Since my illness, she had drawn a more marked line of separation than ever between me and her own children, appointing me a small closet to sleep in by myself, condemning me to take my meals alone and pass all my time in the nursery, while my cousins were constantly in the drawing-room. Not a hint, however, did she drop about sending me to school. Still, I felt an instinctive certainty that she would not long endure me under the same roof with her, for her glance, now more than ever when turned on me, expressed an insuperable and rooted aversion. Liza and Georgiana, evidently acting according to orders, spoke to me as little as possible. John thrust his tongue in his cheek whenever he saw me and once attempted chastisement, but as I instantly and turned against him, roused by the same sentiment of deep ire and desperate revolt which had stirred my corruption before, he thought it better to desist and ran from me, uttering execrations and vowing I had burst his nose. I had indeed levelled at that prominent feature as hard a blow as my knuckles could inflict, and when I saw that either that or my look daunted him, I had the greatest inclination to follow up my advantage to purpose, but he was already with his mamma. I heard him in a blubbering tone commence the tale how that nasty Jane Eyre had flown him like a mad cat. He was stopped rather harshly.
Don't talk to me about her, John. I told you not to go near her. She is not worthy of notice. I do not choose that either you or your sisters should associate with her.
Here, leaning over the banister, I cried out suddenly and without at all deliberating on my words.
They are not fit to associate with me.
Mrs. Reade was rather a stout woman. On hearing this strange and audacious declaration, she ran nimbly up the stair, swept me like a whirlwind into the nursery, and crushing me down on the edge of my crib, dared me in an emphatic voice to rise from that place or utter one syllable during the remainder of the day.
What would Uncle Reade say to you if he were alive?
was my scarcely voluntary demand. I say scarcely voluntary, for it seemed as if my tongue pronounced words without my will consenting to their utterance. Something spoke out of me which I had no control.
What?
Said Mrs. Reed under her breath. Her usually cold, composed grey eye became troubled with a look like fear. She took her hand from my arm and gazed at me as if she really did not know whether I was a child or a fiend. I was now in for it.
My Uncle Reed is in heaven and can see all you do and think. And so can Papa and Mama. They know how you shut me up all day long and how you wish me dead.
Mrs. Reed soon rallied her spirits. She shook me most soundly. She boxed both my ears and then left me without a word. Bessie supplied the hiatus by a homily of an hour's length, in which she proved beyond a doubt that I was the most wicked and abandoned child ever reared under a roof. I half believed her, for I felt indeed only bad feelings surging in my breast. November, December, and half of January passed away. Christmas and the New Year had been celebrated at Gateshead with the usual festive cheer. Presents had been interchanged, dinners and evening parties given. From every enjoyment I was, of course, excluded. My share of the gaiety consisted in witnessing the daily appareling of Eliza and Georgiana, and seeing them descend to the drawing-room, dressed out in thin muslin frocks and scarlet sashes, with their hair elaborately ringleted, and afterwards in listening to the sound of the piano or the harp played below, the passing to and fro of the butler and the footmen, to the jingling of the glass and china as refreshments were handed, to the broken hum of conversion as the drawing-room door opened and closed. When tired of this occupation, I would retire from the stairhead to the solitary and silent nursery. There, though somewhat sad, I was not miserable. To speak truth, I had not the least wish to go into company, for in company I was very rarely noticed, and if Bessie had been but kind and companionable, I should have deemed it a treat to spend the evenings quietly with her, instead of passing them under the formidable eye of Mrs. Reed in a room full of ladies and gentlemen. But Bessie, as soon as she had dressed her young ladies, used to take herself off to the lively regions of the kitchen and the housekeeper's room, generally bearing the candle along with her. I then sat with my doll on my knee till the fire got low, glancing around occasionally to make sure that nothing worse than myself haunted the shadowy room, and when the embers sank to a dull red, I undressed, hastily tugging at the knots and strings as I best might, and sought shelter from cold and darkness in my crib. To this crib I always took my doll. Human beings must love something, and in the dearth of worthier objects of affection, I contrived to find pleasure in loving and cherishing a faded graven image, shabby as a miniature scarecrow. It puzzles me now to remember with what absurd sincerity I doted on this little toy, half fancying it alive and capable of sensation. I could not sleep unless it was folded in my nightgown, and when it lay there safe and warm, I was comparatively happy, believing it to be happy likewise. Long did the hours seem while I waited the departure of the company and listened for the sound of Bessie's steps on the stairs. Sometimes she would come up in the interval to seek her thimble or her scissors, or perhaps to bring me something by way of supper, a bun or a cheesecake. Then she would sit on the bed while I ate it, and when I had finished, she would tuck the clothes round me, and twice she kissed me and said,
"Good night, Miss Jane."
When thus gentle, Bessie seemed to me the best, prettiest, kindest being in the world, and I wished most intensely that she would always be so pleasant and amiable, and never push me about or scold or task me unreasonably as she was too often wont to do. Bessie Lee must, I think, have been a girl of good natural capacity, for she was smart in all that she did, and had a remarkable knack of narrative, so at least I judged from the impression made on me by her nursery tales. She was pretty too, if my recollections of her face and person are correct. I remember her as a slim young woman with black hair, dark eyes, and very nice features, and a good, clear complexion. But she had a capricious and hasty temper, and indifferent ideas of principle or justice. Still, such as she was, I preferred her to anyone else at Great Gateshead Hall. It was the 15th of January, about 9 o'clock in the morning. Bessie was gone down to breakfast. My cousins had not yet been summoned to their mamma. Eliza was putting on her bonnet and warm garden coat to go and feed her poultry, an occupation of which she was fond, and not less so of selling the eggs to the housekeeper and hoarding up the money she thus obtained. She had a turn for traffic and marked propensity for saving, shown not only in the vending of eggs and chickens, but also in driving hard bargains with the gardener about flower roots, seeds, and slips of plant that functionary having orders from Mrs. Reed to buy of this young lady all the products of her parterre she wished to sell, and Eliza would have sold a hair off her head if she could have made a handsome profit thereby. As to the money, she first secreted in odd corners, wrapped in a rag or old curl paper. But some of these hoards having been discovered by the housemaid, Eliza, fearful of one day losing her valued treasure, consented to entrust it to her mother at an usurious rate of interest, 50 or 60%, which interest she exacted every quarter, keeping her accounts in a little book with anxious accuracy. Georgiana sat on a high stool, dressing her hair at the glass and interweaving her curls with artificial flowers and faded feathers of which she had found a store in a drawer in the attic. I was making my bed, having received strict orders from Bessie to get it arranged before she returned, for Bessie now frequently employed me as a sort of under-nursery maid to tidy the room, dust the chairs, etc. Having spread the quilt and folded my nightdress, I went to the window seat to put in order some picture books and doll's house furniture scattered there. An abrupt command from Georgiana to let her playthings alone, for the tiny chairs and mirrors, the fairy plate and cups were her property, stopped my proceedings, and then, for lack of other occupation, I fell to breathing on the frost flowers with which the window was fretted, and thus clearing a space in the glass through which I might look out onto the grounds, where all was still and petrified under the influence of a hard frost. From this window were visible the porter's lodge and the carriage road, and just as I had dissolved so much of the silver white foliage veiling the panes as left room to look out, I saw the gates thrown open and a carriage roll through. I watched it ascending the drive with indifference. Carriages often came to Gateshead, but none ever brought visitors in whom I was interested in. It stopped in front of the house. The doorbell rang loudly. The new corner was admitted. All this being nothing to me. My vacant attraction soon found livelier attraction in the spectacle of a little hungry robin, which came and chirruped on the twigs of the leafless cherry tree nailed against the wall near the casement. The remains of my breakfast, bread and milk, stood on the table, and having crumbled a morsel of roll, I was tugging at the sash to put out the crumbs on the windowsill when Bessie came running upstairs into the nursery.
Miss Jane, take off your pinafore. What are you doing there? Have you washed your hands and face this morning?
I gave another tug before I answered, for I wanted the bird to be secure of its bread. The sash yielded. I scattered the crumbs, some on the stone sill, some on the cherry tree bough. Then, closing the window, I replied,
"No, Bessie, I've only just finished dusting."
Troublesome, careless child. And what are you doing now? You look quite red, as if you had been about some mischief. What were you opening the window for?
I was spared the trouble of answering, for Bessie seemed in too great a hurry to listen to explanations. She hauled me to the washstand, inflicted merciless but happily brief scrub on my face and hands with soap, water, and a coarse towel, disciplined my head with a bristly brush, denuded me of my pinafore, and then, hurrying me to the top of the stairs, bid me go down directly as I was wanted in the breakfast room. I would have asked who wanted me. I would have demanded if Mrs. Reed was there, but Bessie was already gone and had closed the nursery door upon me. I slowly descended. For nearly 3 months, I had never been called to Mrs. Reed's presence. Restricted so long to the nursery, the breakfast, the dining, and the drawing rooms were become for me awful regions on which it dismayed me to intrude. I now stood in the empty hall. Before me was the breakfast room door, and I stopped, intimidated and trembling. What a miserable little poltroon had fear engendered of unjust punishment made of me in those days. I feared to return, I feared to return to the nursery and feared to go forward into the parlour. 10 minutes I stood in agitated hesitation. The vehement ringing of the breakfast room bell decided me. I must enter.
Who could want me?
I asked inwardly, as with both hands I turned the stiff door handle, which for a second or two resisted my efforts.
What should I see besides Aunt Reed in the apartment? A man or a woman?
The handle turned, the door unclosed, and passing through and curtsying low, I looked up at a black pillar. Such at least appeared to me at first sight, the straight, narrow, sable-clad shape standing erect on the rug. The grim face at the top was like a carved mask placed above the shaft by way of capital. Mrs. Reed occupied her usual seat by the fireside. She made a signal to me to approach. I did so, and she introduced me to the stony stranger with the words,
This is the little girl respecting whom I applied to you.
He, for it was a man, turned his head slowly towards where I stood, and having examined me with two inquisitive-looking grey eyes which twinkled under a pair of bushy brows, said solemnly in a bass voice,
Her size is small. What is her age?
10 years.
So much?
Was the doubtful answer, and he prolonged his scrutiny for some minutes. Presently, he addressed me.
Your name, little girl?
Jane
Jane-
Eyre, sir.
In uttering these words, I looked up. He seemed to me a tall gentleman, but then I was very little. His features were large, and all the lines of his frame were equally harsh and prim.
Well, Jane Eyre. And are you a good child?
Impossible to reply to this in the affirmative. My little world held a contrary opinion. I was silent. Mrs. Reed answered for me by an expressive shake of the head, adding soon,
Perhaps the less said on that subject, the better, Mr. Brocklehurst.
Sorry indeed to hear it. She and I must have some talk.
and bending from the perpendicular, he installed his person in the armchair opposite Mrs. Reed.
Come here.
I stepped across the rug. He placed me square and straight before him. What a face he had, now that it was almost on a level with mine. What a great nose, and what a mouth, and what large, prominent teeth.
No sight so sad as that of a naughty child, especially a naughty little girl. Do you know where the wicked go after death?
They go to hell?
Was my ready and orthodox answer.
And what is hell? Can you tell me that?
A pit full of fire.
And should you like to fall into that pit and to be burning there forever?
No, sir.
What must you do to avoid it?
I deliberated a moment. My answer, when it did come, was objectionable.
I must keep in good health and not die.
How can you keep in good health? Children younger than you die daily. I buried a little child of 5 years old only a day or two since. A good little child whose soul is now in heaven. It is to be feared the same could not be said of you were you to be called hence.
Not being in a condition to remove his doubt, I only cast my eyes down on the two large feet planted on the rug and sighed, wishing myself far enough away.
I hope that sigh is from the heart, and that you repent of ever having been the occasion of discomfort to your excellent benefactress.
Benefactress, benefactress, I said inwardly. They all call Mrs. Reed my benefactress. If so, a benefactress is a disagreeable thing.
Do you say your prayers night and morning?
Continued
sir.
my interrogator.
Yes, sir.
Do you read your Bible?
Sometimes.
With pleasure. Are you fond of it?
I like Revelations and the book of Daniel and Genesis and Samuel and a little bit of Exodus and some parts of Kings and Chronicles and Job and Jonah.
And the Psalms? I hope you like them.
No, sir.
No? Oh, shocking. I have a little boy, younger than you, who knows 6 Psalms by heart. And when you ask him which he would rather have, a gingerbread nut to eat or a verse of a psalm to learn, he says, "Oh, the verse of a psalm. Angels sing psalms," says he. "I wish to be a little angel here below." He then gets 2 nuts in recompense for his infant piety.
Psalms are not interesting.
I remarked.
Oh, that proves you have a wicked heart, and you must pray to God to change it, to give you a new and clean one, to take away your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh.
I was about to propound a question touching the manner in which the operation of changing my heart was to be performed when Mrs. Reed interposed, telling me to sit down. She then proceeded to carry on the conversation herself.
Mr. Brocklehurst, I believe I intimated in the letter which I wrote you 3 weeks ago that this little girl has not quite the character and disposition I could wish. Should you admit her into Lowood School, I should be glad if the superintendent and teachers were requested to keep a strict eye on her and, above all, to guard against her worst fault, a tendency to deceit. I mentioned this in your hearing, Jane, that you may not attempt to impose on Mr. Brocklehurst.
Well might I dread, well might I like Mrs. Reed, for it was her nature to wound me cruelly. Never was I happy in her presence. However carefully I obeyed, however strenuously I strove to please her, my efforts were still repulsed and repaid by such sentences as the above. Now uttered before a stranger, the accusation cut me to the heart. I dimly perceived that she was already obliterating hope from the new phase of existence which she destined me to enter. I felt, though I could not have expressed the feeling, that she was sowing aversion and unkindness along my future path. I saw myself transformed under Mr. Brocklehurst's eye into an awful, noxious child, and what could I do to remedy the injury?
Thing indeed.
I thought, as I struggled to repress a sob and hastily wiped away some tears, the impotent evidences of my languish.
Deceit is, indeed, a sad fault in a child. It is akin to falsehood, and all liars will have their portion in the lake burning with fire and brimstone. She shall, however, be watched, Mrs. Reed. I will speak to Miss Temple and the teachers.
I should wish her to be brought up in a manner suiting her prospects, to be made useful, to be kept humble. As for the vacations, she will, with your permission, spend them always at Lowood.
Your decisions are perfectly judicious, madam. Humility is a Christian grace and one peculiarly appropriate to the pupils of Lowood. I, therefore, direct that especial care shall be bestowed on its cultivation amongst them. I have studied how best to mortify in them the worldly sentiment of pride, and only the other day I had a pleasing proof of my success. My second daughter, Augusta, went with her mamma to visit the school, and on her return she exclaimed, "Oh dear papa, how quiet and plain all the girls at Lowood look, with their hair combed behind their ears and their long pinafores and those little holland pockets outside their frocks. They are almost like poor people's children. And," she said, "they look at my dress and mamma's as if they had never seen a silk gown before."
This is the state of things I quite approve. Had I sought all England over, I could scarcely have found a system more exactly fitting a child like Jane Eyre. Constancy, my dear Mr. Brocklehurst, consistency. I advocate consistency in all things.
Consistency, madam, is the first of Christian duties, and it has been observed in every arrangement connected with the establishment of Lowood. Plain fare, simple attire, unsophisticated accommodations, hardy and active habits. Such is the order of the day in the house and its inhabitants.
Quite right, sir. I may then depend upon this child being received as a pupil at Lowood and there being trained in conformity to her position and prospects.
Madam, you may. She shall be placed in that nursery of chosen plants, and I trust she will show herself grateful for the inestimable privilege of her election.
I will send her then as soon as possible, Mr. Brocklehurst, for I assure you, I feel anxious to be relieved of a responsibility that was becoming too irksome.
Oh, no doubt, madam. And now I wish you good morning. I shall return to Brocklehurst Hall in the course of a week or two. My good friend, the Archdeacon, will not permit me to leave him sooner. I shall send Miss Temple notice that she is to expect a new girl, so there will be no difficulty about receiving her. Goodbye.
Goodbye, Mr. Brocklehurst. Remember me to Mrs. and Miss Brocklehurst and to Augusta and Theodore and Master Broughton Brocklehurst.
I will, madam. Little girl, here is a book entitled The Child's Guide. Read it with prayer, especially the part containing an account of the awfully sudden death of Martha G., a naughty child addicted to falsehood and deceit.
With these words, Mr. Brocklehurst put into my hand a thin pamphlet sewn into a cover, and having rung for his carriage, he departed. Mrs. Reed and I were left alone. Some minutes passed in silence. She was sewing. I was watching her. Mrs. Reed might be at that time some 6 or 7 and 30. She was a woman of robust frame, square-shouldered and strong-limbed, not tall, and though stout, not obese. She had a somewhat large face, the underjaw being much developed and very solid. Her brow was low, her chin large and prominent, mouth and nose sufficiently regular. Under her light eyebrows glimmered an eye devoid of ruth. Her skin was dark and opaque, her hair nearly flaxen. Her constitution was sound as a bell. Illness never came to her. She was an exact, clever manager. Her household and tenery were thoroughly under her control. Her children only at times defied her authority and laughed it to scorn. She dressed well and had a presence and port calculated to set off handsome attire. Sitting on a low stool a few yards from her armchair, I examined her figure. I perused her features. In my hand, I held the tract containing the sudden death of the liar, to which narrative my attention had been pointed to the appropriate warning. What had just passed, what Mr. Reed had said concerning me to Mr. Brocklehurst, the whole tenor of their conversation was recent, raw, and stinging in my mind. I had felt every word as acutely as I had heard it plainly, and a passion of resentment fermented now within me. Mrs. Reed looked up from her work. Her eye settled on mine. Her fingers at the same time suspended their nimble movements.
Go out of the room. Return to the nursery,
Was her mandate. My look or something else must have struck her as offensive, for she spoke with an extreme, tough, suppressed irritation. I got up. I went to the door. I came back again. I walked to the window across the room, then close up to her. Speak, I must. I had been trodden on severely and must turn. But how? What strength had I to dart retaliation at my antagonist? I gathered my energies and launched them into a blunt sentence.
I am not deceitful. If I were, I should say I loved you, but I declare I do not love you. I dislike you the worst of anybody in the world except John Reed, and this book about the liar you may give to your girl, Georgiana, for it is she who tells lies and not I.
Mrs. Reed's hands still lay on her work, inactive. Her eyes of ice continued to dwell freezingly on mine.
What more have you to say?
She asked, rather in the tone in which a person might address an opponent of adult age than such as it is ordinarily used to a child. The eye of hers that voiced stirred every antipathy I had. Shaking from head to foot, thrilled with ungovernable excitement, I continued.
I am glad you are no relation of mine. I will never call you aunt again as long as I live. I will never come to see you when I am grown up. And if anyone asks me how I liked you and how you treated me, I will say the very thought of you makes me sick and that you treated me with miserable cruelty.
How dare you affirm that, Jane Eyre?
How dare I, Mrs. Reed? How dare I? Because it is the truth. You think I have no feelings, that I can do without one bit of love or kindness, but I cannot live so. And you have no pity. I shall remember how you thrust me back, roughly and violently thrust me back into the Red Room and locked me up there to my dying day, though I was in agony, though I cried out while suffocating with distress, have mercy, Aunt Reed. And that punishment you made me suffer because your wicked boy struck me and knocked me down for nothing. I will tell anybody who asks me questions this exact tale. People think you are a good woman, but you are a bad, hard-hearted, you are deceitful.
Ere I had finished this reply, my soul began to expand, to exult with the strangest sense of freedom, of triumph I ever felt. It seemed as if an invisible bond had burst, that I had struggled out into unhoped-for liberty. Not without case was this sentiment. Mrs. Reed looked frightened. Her work had slipped from her knee. She was lifting up her hands, rocking herself to and fro, and even twisting her face as if she would cry.
Jane, you are under a mistake. What is the matter with you? Why do you tremble so violently? Would you like to drink some water?
No, Mrs. Reed.
Is there anything else you wish for, Jane? I assure you, I desire to be your friend.
Not you. You told Mr. Brocklehurst I had a bad character, a deceitful disposition, and I'll let everybody at Lowood know what you are and what you have done.
Jane, you don't understand these things. Children must be corrected for their faults.
Deceit is not my fault!
I cried out in a savage, high voice.
But you are passionate, Jane, that you must allow. And now return to the nursery. There's a dear, and lie down a little.
I am not your dear. I cannot lie down. Send me to school soon, Mrs. Reed, for I hate to live here.
I will indeed send her to school soon,
murmured Mrs. Reed, sotto voce, and gathering up her work, she abruptly quitted the apartment. I was left there alone, winner of the field. It was the hardest battle I had fought, and the first victory I had gained. I stood a while on the rug where Mrs. Brocklehurst had stood, and I enjoyed my conqueror's solitude. For first, I smiled to myself and felt elate, but this fierce pleasure subsided in me as fast as did the accelerated throb of my pulses. A child cannot quarrel with its elders, as I had done, cannot give its furious feelings uncontrolled play, as I had given mine, without experiencing afterwards the pang of remorse and the chill of reaction. A ridge of lighted heath, alive and glancing, devouring, would have been a meet emblem of my mind when I accused and menaced Mrs. Reed. The same ridge, black and blasted after the flames are dead, would have represented as meetly my subsequent condition when half an hour's silence and reflection had shown me the madness of my conduct and the dreariness of my hatred and hating position. Something of vengeance I had tasted for the first time, as aromatic wine it seemed, on swallowing warm and racy. Its after flavour, metallic and corroding, gave me a sensation as if I had been poisoned. Willingly would I now have gone and asked Mrs. Reed's pardon, but I knew partly from experience and partly from instinct that was the way to make her repulse me with double scorn, thereby re-exciting every turbulent impulse of my nature. I would fain exercise some better faculty than that of fierce speaking, fain find nourishment from some less fiendish feeling than that of somber indignation. I took a book, some Arabian tales. I sat down and endeavored to read. I could make no sense of the subject. My own thoughts swam always between me and the page I had usually found fascinating. I opened the glass door in the breakfast room. The shrubbery was quite still. Black frost reigned unbroken by sun or breeze through the grounds. I covered my head and arms with the skirt of my frock and went out for a walk in part of the plantation, which was quite sequestered. But I found no pleasure in the silent trees, for falling fir cones, the congealed relics of autumn russet leaves, swept by past winds in heaps and now stiffened together. I leaned against a gate and looked into an empty field where no sheep were feeding, where the short grass was nipped and blanched. It was a very grey day, most opaque sky, onding and snore, canopied all. Thence flakes fell at intervals which settled on the hard path and on the hoary lea without melting. I stood, a wretched child enough, whispering to myself over and over again.
What shall I do? What shall I do?
All at once I heard a clear voice call.
Miss Jane, where are you? Come to lunch.
It was Bessie. I knew well enough, but I did not stir. Her light step came tripping down the path.
You naughty little thing. Why don't you come when you're called?
Bessie's presence, compared with the thoughts over which I had been brooding, seemed cheerful, even though, as usual, she was somewhat cross. The fact is, after my conflict with and victory over Mrs. Reed, I was not disposed to care much for the nursemaid's transitory anger. I was disposed to bask in her youthful lightness of heart. I just put my 2 arms around her and said, Come, Bessie.
Don't scold.
The action was more frank and fearless than any I was habituated to indulge in. Somehow it pleased her.
You're a strange child, Miss Jane. A little roving, solitary thing. And you're going to school, I suppose?
I nodded.
And won't you be sorry to leave poor Bessie?
What does Bessie care for me? She's always scolding me.
Because you're such a queer, frightened, shy little thing. You should be bolder.
What? To get more knocks?
Nonsense. But you are rather put upon, that's certain. My mother said when she came to see me last week that she would not like a little one of her own to be in your place. Now come in, and I've some good news for you.
I don't think you have, Bessie.
Child, what do you mean? What sorrowful eyes you fix on me. Well, but Mrs. and the young ladies and Master John are going out to tea this afternoon, and you shall have tea with me. I'll ask cook to bake you a little cake, and then you shall help me to look over your drawers, for I am soon to pack your trunk. Mrs. intends you to leave Gateshead in a day or 2, and you shall choose what toys you like to take with you.
Bessie, you must promise not to scold me anymore till I go.
Well, I will, but mind you are a very good girl and don't be afraid of me. Don't start when I chance to speak rather sharply. It's so provoking.
I don't think I shall ever be afraid of you again, Bessie, because I've got used to you, and I shall soon have another set of people to dread.
If you dread them, they'll dislike you.
As you do, Bessie?
I don't dislike you, miss. I believe I'm fonder of you than of all the others.
You don't show it.
You little sharp thing. You've got quite a new way of talking. What makes you so venturesome and hearty?
Why, I shall soon be away from you, and besides...
I was going to say something about what had passed between me and Mrs. Reed, but on second thoughts, I considered it to remain silent on that head.
And so you're glad to leave me?
Not at all, Bessie. Indeed, just right now, I am rather sorry.
Just now, and rather. How coolly my little lady says it. I dare say now, if I were to ask you for a kiss, you wouldn't give it to me. You'd say, I'd rather not.
I'll kiss you and welcome. Bend your head down.
Bessie stooped. We mutually embraced, and I followed her into the house, quite comforted. That afternoon lapsed into peace and harmony, and in the evening, Bessie told me some of her most enchanting stories, and sang me some of her sweetest songs. Even for me, life had its gleams of sunshine. Chapter 5. 5 o'clock had hardly struck on the morning of the 19th of January when Bessie brought a candle into my closet and found me already up and nearly dressed. I had risen half an hour before her entrance and had washed my face and put on my clothes by the light of a half-moon setting, whose rays streamed through the narrow window near my crib. I was to leave Gateshead that day by a coach which passed the lodge gates at 6 a.m. Bessie was the only person yet risen. She had lit a fire in the nursery, where she now proceeded to make my breakfast. Few children can eat when excited with the thoughts of a journey. Nor could I. Bessie, having pressed me in vain to take a few spoonfuls of the boiled milk and bread she had prepared for me, wrapped up some biscuits in a paper and put them into my bag. She then helped me on with my pelisse and bonnet, and wrapping herself in a shawl, she and I left the nursery. As we passed Mrs. Reed's bedroom, she said,
Will you go in and bid Mrs. goodbye?
No, Bessie. She came to my crib last night when you were gone down to supper and said I need not disturb her in the morning, or my cousins either. And she told me to remember that she had always been my best friend and to speak of her and be grateful to her accordingly.
What did you say, miss?
Nothing. I covered my face with the bedclothes and turned from her to the wall.
That was wrong, Miss Jane.
It was quite right, Bessie. Your missus has not been my friend. She has been my foe.
Oh, Miss Jane, don't say so.
Goodbye to Gateshead,
cried I, as we passed through the hall and went out at the front door. The moon was set, and it was very dark. Bessie carried a lantern whose light glanced on the wet steps and gravel, road sodden by a recent thaw. Raw and chill was the winter morning. My teeth chattered as I hastened down the drive. There was a light in the porter's lodge when we reached it. We found the porter's wife just kindling her fire. My trunk, which had been carried down the evening before, stood corded at the door. I wanted but a few minutes of 6, and shortly after that hour had struck, the distant roll of wheels announced the coming coach. I went to the door and watched its lamps approach rapidly through the gloom.
Is she going by herself?
Yes.
And how far is it?
50 miles.
What a long way. I wonder Mrs. Reed is not afraid to trust her so far alone.
The coach drew up. There it was, at the gates, with all its 4 horses and its top laden with passengers. The guard and the coachman loudly urged to haste. My trunk was hoisted up. I was taken from Bessie's neck, at which I clung with kisses.
Be sure and take good care of her,
cried she to the guard as she lifted me into the inside.
Aye.
Was the answer. The door was slapped to. A voice exclaimed,
All right.
And on we drove. Thus was I severed from Bessie and Gateshead, thus whirled away to unknown and, as I then deemed, remote and mysterious regions. I remember but little of the journey. I only know that the day seemed to me of a paternal length, and that we appeared to travel over hundreds of miles of road. We passed through several towns, and in one, a very large one, the coach stopped. The horses were taken out, and the passengers alighted to dine. I was carried into an inn, where the guard wanted me to have some dinner, but as I had no appetite, he left me in an immense room with a fireplace at each end, a chandelier present from the ceiling, and a little red gallery high up against the wall fitted with some musical instruments. Here I walked about for a long time, feeling very strange and mortally apprehensive of someone coming in and kidnapping me, for I believed in kidnappers, their exploits having frequently figured in Bessie's fireside chronicles. At last the guard returned. Once more I was stowed away in the coach. My protector mounted his own seat, sounded his hollow horn, and away we rattled over the stony street of London. The afternoon came on wet and somewhat misty. As it waned into the dusk, I began to feel that we were getting very far indeed from Gateshead. We ceased to pass through towns. The counties changed. Grey hills heaved up round the horizon as twilight deepened. We descended into a valley, dark with wood, and long after night had overclouded the prospect, I heard a wild wind rushing amongst the trees. Lulled by the sound, I at last dropped asleep. I had not long slumbered when the sudden cessation of motion awoke me. The coach door was open, and a person, like a servant, was standing at it. I saw her face and dress by the light of the lamps.
Is there a little girl called Jane Eyre here?
She asked. I answered, yes.
Yes.
And then was lifted out. My trunk was handed down and instantly drove away. I was stiff with long sitting and bewildered with the noise and motion of the coach, gathering my faculties. I looked about me. Rain, wind, and darkness filled the air. Nevertheless, I dimly discerned a wall before me and a door open in it. Through this door I passed with my new guide. She shut and locked it behind her. There was now visible a house or houses, for the building spread far, with many windows and lights burning in some. We went up a broad, pebbly path, splashing wet, and were admitted at a door. Then the servant led me through a passage into a room with a fire, where she left me alone. I stood and warmed my numbed fingers over the blaze. Then I looked round. There was no candle, but the uncertain light from the hearth showed, by intervals, papered walls, carpet, curtains, shining mahogany furniture. It was a parlour, not so spacious or splendid as the drawing room at the Gateshead, but comfortable enough. I was puzzling to make out the subject of a picture on the wall when the door opened and an individual carrying a light entered. Another followed close behind. The first was a tall lady with dark hair, dark eyes, and a pale and large forehead. Her figure was partly enveloped in a shawl. Her countenance was grave, her bearing erect.
The child is very young to be sent alone,
she said, putting her candle down on the table. She considered me attentively for a minute or two, then further added,
she had better be put to bed soon. She looks tired. Are you tired?
She asked, placing her hand on my shoulder.
A little, ma'am.
And hungry too, no doubt. Let her have some supper before she goes to bed, Miss Miller. Is this the first time you have left your parents to come to school, my little girl?
I explained to her that I had no parents. She inquired how long they had been dead, and then how old I was, what my name, whether I could read, write, and sew a little. Then she touched my cheek gently with her forefinger, saying she hoped I would be a good little child, dismissed me along with Miss Miller. The lady I had left might be about 29. The one who went with me appeared some years younger. The first impressed me by her voice, look, and air. Miss Miller was more ordinary, ruddy in complexion, though of a careworn countenance, hurried in gait and action, like one who had always had a multiplicity of tasks on hand. She looked, indeed, what I afterwards found she really was, an under-teacher. Led by her, I passed from compartment to compartment, from passage to passage of a large and irregular building, till, emerging from the total and somewhat dreary silence pervading that portion of the house we had traversed, we came upon the hum of many voices. And presently entered a wild, long room with great deal tables, 2 at each end, on each of which burnt a pair of candles, and seated all round on benches a congregation of girls every age from 9 or 10 to 20. Seen by the dim light of the dips, their number to me appeared countless, though not in reality exceeding 80. They were uniformed uniformly dressed in brown stuff frocks of quaint fashion and long Holland pinafores. It was their hour of study. They were engaged in conning over their tomorrow's task, and in the hum I had heard was the combined result of their whispered repetitions. Miss Miller signed to me to sit on a bench near the door. Then, walking up to the top of the long room, she cried out,
"Monitors, collect the lesson books and put them away."
4 tall girls arose from different tables and, going round, gathered the books and removed them. Miss Miller again gave the word of command.
"Monitors, fetch the supper trays."
The tall girls went out and returned presently, each bearing a tray with portions of something. I knew not what arranged thereon, and a pitcher of water and mug in the middle of each tray. The portions were handed round. Those who looked like a draught of water, those who looked like a draught of the water, the mug being common to all. When it came to my turn, I drank, for I was thirsty, but did not touch the food. Excitement and fatigue rendering me incapable of eating. I now saw, however, that it was a thin oaten cake shared into fragments. The meal over, prayers were read by Miss Miller, and the classes filed off 2 and 2 upstairs. Overpowered by this time with weariness, I scarcely noticed what sort of place the bedroom was. I expect that, like the schoolroom, I saw it was very long. Tonight, I was to be Miss Miller's bedfellow. She helped me to undress. When I laid down, glanced at the rows of beds, each of which was quickly filled with 2 occupants in 10 minutes, the single light was extinguished, and amidst the silence and complete darkness, I fell asleep. The night passed rapidly. I was too tired to even dream. I only once awoke to hear the wind rave in furious gusts, and the rain fell in torrents, and to be sensible that Miss Miller had taken her place by my side. When again unclosed my eyes, a loud bell was ringing. The girls were up and dressing. Day had not yet begun to dawn, and a rushlight or 2 burned in the room. I rose too reluctantly. It was bitter cold, and I dressed as well as I could for shivering, and washed when there was a basin at liberty, which did not occur soon, as there was but 1 basin to 6 girls on the stands down in the middle of the room. Against the bell rang, all formed in file, 2 and 2, and in that order descended the stairs and entered the cold and dimly lit schoolroom. Here prayers were read by Miss Miller. Afterwards she called out,
"Form classes."
A great tumult succeeded for some minutes, during which Miss Miller repeated exclaims, "Silence!" and "Order!" When it subsided, I saw them all drawn up in 4 semicircles before 4 chairs placed at the 4 tables. All held books in their hands, and a great book like a Bible lay on each table before the vacant seat. A pause of some seconds succeeded, filled up by the low, vague hum of numbers. Miss Miller walked from class to class, hushing this indefinite sound. A distant bell tinkled. Immediately, 3 ladies entered the room. Each walked to a table and took her seat. Miss Miller assumed the 4th vacant chair, which was that nearest to the door, and around which the smallest of the children were assembled. To this inferior class I was called and placed at the bottom of it. Business now began. The day's collect was repeated, then certain texts of scripture were said, and to these succeeded by a protracted reading of chapters in the Bible, which lasted an hour. By the time that exercise was terminated, day had fully dawned. The indefatigable bell was now sounded for the 4th time. The classes were marshalled and marched into another room to breakfast. How glad I was to behold a prospect of getting something to eat. I was now nearly sick from inanition, having taken only so little the day before. The refectory was a great, low-ceilinged, gloomy room. On 2 long tables, smoked basin of something hot, which, however, to my dismay, sent forth an odour far from inviting. I saw a universal manifestation of discontent when the fumes of the repast met the nostrils of those destined to swallow it. From the van of procession, the tall girls to the first of the class rose with the whispered words.
Disgusting. The porridge is burnt again.
Silence.
Ejaculated a voice, not that of Mrs. Miller, but one of the upper teachers, a little and dark personage, smartly dressed but of somewhat morose aspect, who installed herself at the top of one table, while a more buxom lady presided at the other. I looked in vain for her. I had first seen the night before, but she was not visible. Miss Miller occupied the foot of the table where I sat, and a strange, foreign-looking, elderly lady, the French teacher, as I afterwards found, took the corresponding seat at the other board. A long grace was said and a hymn sung. Then a servant brought in some tea for the teachers, and the meal began. Ravenous, and now very faint, I devoured a spoonful or two of my portion without thinking of its taste. But the first edge of hunger blunted. I perceived I had not got in hand a nauseous mess. A burnt porridge is almost as bad as rotten potatoes. Famine itself soon sickens over it. The spoons were moved slowly. I saw each girl taste her food and try to swallow it, but in most cases the effort was soon relinquished. Breakfast was over and none had breakfasted. Thanks being returned for that which we had not got, and a second hymn chanted, the refectory was evacuated for the schoolroom. It was one of the last to go out, and in passing the tables, I saw one teacher take a basin of the porridge and taste it. She looked at the others, all their countenances expressed displeasure, and one of them, the stout one, whispered,
Abominable stuff. How shameful. Ugh.
A quarter of an hour passed before lessons again began, during which the schoolroom was in glorious tumult. For that space of time it seemed to be permitted to talk loud and more freely, and they used their privilege. The whole conversation ran on the breakfast, which one and all abused roundly. Poor things! It was the sole consolation they had. Miss Miller was now the only teacher in the room. A group of great girls standing about her spoke with serious and sullen gestures. I heard the name of Mr. Brockhurst pronounced by some lips, at which Miss Miller shook her head disapprovingly, but she made no great effort to check the general wrath. Doubtless she shared in it. A clock in the schoolroom struck 9. Miss Miller left her circle and, standing in the middle of the room, cried,
Silence! To your seats!
Discipline prevailed. In 5 minutes, the confused throng was resolved in order, and comparative silence quelled the babel clamour of tongues. The upper teachers now punctually resumed their posts, but still all seemed to wait. Ranged on benches down the sides of the room, the 80 girls sat motionless and erect. A quaint assemblage they appeared, all with plain locks combed from their faces. Not a curl visible, in brown dresses made high and surrounded by a narrow tucker about the throat, with little pockets of holland shaped something like a Highlander's purse, tied in front of their frocks and destined to serve the purpose of a work bag. All, too, wearing woolen stockings and country-made shoes fastened with brass buckles. Above 20 of those clad in this costume were full-grown girls, rather young women. It suited them ill and gave them an air of oddity, even to the prettiest. It was still, looking at them, and also at the intervals examining the teachers, none of whom precisely pleased me, for the stout one was a little coarse, the dark one not a little fierce, the foreigner harsh and grotesque, and Miss Miller, poor thing, looked purple, weather-beaten and overworked, when, as my eye wandered from face to face, the whole school rose simultaneously as if moved by a common spring. What was the matter? I had heard no order given. I was puzzled. Ere I had gathered my wits, the classes were again seated, but as all eyes were now turned to one point, mine followed the general direction and encountered the personage who had received me last night. She stood at the bottom of the long room on the hearth, for there was a fire at each end. She surveyed the 2 rows of girls silently and gravely. Miss Miller, approaching, seemed to ask her a question, and having received her answer, went back to her place and said aloud,
Monitor of the first class, fetch the globes.
While the direction was being executed, the lady consulted moved slowly up the room. I suppose I have a considerable organ of veneration, for I retain yet the sense of admiring awe with which my eyes traced her steps. Seen now in broad daylight, she looked tall, fair, and shapely. Brown eyes with a benignant light in their irids, and a fine penciling of long lashes round relieved the whiteness of her large front. On each of her temples, her hair of a very dark brown were clustered in round curls, according to the fashion of those times. When neither smooth bands nor long ringlets were in vogue, her dress was her dress, also in the mode of the day, was of purple cloth, received by a sort of Spanish trimming of black velvet. A gold watches were not so common then as now, shone at her girdle. Let the reader add, to complete the picture, refined features, a complexion, if pale, clear, and a stately air and carriage, and he will have, at least as clearly as words can give it, a correct idea of the exterior of Miss Temple. Maria Temple, as I afterwards saw the name written in a prayer book, entrusted me to carry to church. The superintendent of Lowood, for such was this lady, having taken her seat before a pair of globes placed on one of the tables, summoned the first class round her and commenced, giving a lesson on geography. The lower classes were called by the teachers. Repetitions in history, grammar, etc. went on for an hour. Writing and arithmetic succeeded, and music lessons were given by Miss Temple to some of the elder girls. The duration of each lesson was measured by the clock, at which at last struck 12. The superintendent rose.
I have a word to address the pupils,
said she. The tumult of cessation from the lessons was already breaking forth, but it sank at her voice, so she...
You had this morning a breakfast which you could not eat. You must be hungry. I have ordered a lunch. I have ordered that a lunch of bread and cheese shall be served to you all.
The teachers looked to her with a sort of surprise.
It is to be done on my responsibility,
she added in an explanatory tone to them, and immediately afterwards left the room. The bread and cheese was presently brought in and distributed to the high delight and refreshment of the whole school. The order was now given to the garden. Each put on a coarse straw bonnet with strings of coloured calico and a cloak of grey frieze. It was similarly equipped, and, following the stream, I made my way into the open air. The garden was a wide enclosure, surrounded with walls so high as to exclude every glimpse of prospect. A covered veranda ran down one side, and broad walks bordered a middle space divided into scores of little beds. These beds were assigned as gardens for the pupils to cultivate, and each bed had an owner. When full of flowers, they would doubtless look pretty, but now, at the latter end of the day, I stood and looked round me. It was an inclement day for outdoor exercise, not positively rainy, but darkened by a drizzling yellow fog. All underfoot was still soaking wet with the floods of yesterday. The stronger among the girls ran about and engaged in active games, but sundry pale and thin ones herded together for shelter and warmth in the veranda. And amongst these, as the dense mist penetrated to their shivering frames, I heard frequently the sound of a hollow cough. As yet,
Alice, take a break. Go get a drink. I'm going to fill in for you. Come back when you're ready. Okay. So I'm going to be the narrator for until Alice can rejoin her voice. As yet, I had spoken to no one, nor did anyone seem to take notice of me. I stood lonely enough, but to that feeling of isolation I was accustomed. It did not oppress me much. I leant against a pillar of the veranda, drew my gray mantle close about me, and trying to forget the cold which nipped me without, and the unsatisfied hunger which gnawed me within, delivered myself up to the employment of watching and thinking. My reflections were too undefined and fragmentary to merit record. I hardly yet knew where I was. Gateshead and my past life seemed floated away to an immeasurable distance. The present was vague and strange, and of the future I could form no conjecture. I looked around the convent-like garden and then up at the house, a large building, half of which seemed gray and old, the other half quite new. The new part, containing the schoolroom and dormitory, was lit by mullioned and latticed windows, which gave it a church-like aspect. A stone tablet over the door bore this inscription: Lowood Institution. This portion was built A.D. in the year by Naomi Brocklehurst of Brocklehurst Hall in this county. Let your light shine so before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. St. Matthew, verse 16. I read these words over and over again. I felt that an explanation belonged to them and was unable to fully penetrate their import. I was still pondering the signification of institution and endeavoring to make out a connection between the first words and the verse of scripture when the sound of a cough close behind me made me return to my head. I saw a girl sitting on a stone bench near. She was bent over a book, on the perusal of which she seemed intent. From where I stood, I could see the title. It was Rasselas, a name that struck me as strange and consequently attractive. In turning a leaf, she happened to look up, and I said to her directly,
"Is your book interesting?"
I had already formed the intention of asking her to lend it to me someday.
I like it.
She answered after a pause of a second or two, during which she examined me.
"What is it about?"
I continued. I hardly know where I found the hardihood thus to open a conversation with a stranger. The step was contrary to my nature and habits, but I think her occupation touched a chord of sympathy somewhere, for I too liked reading, though of a frivolous and childish kind. I could not digest or comprehend the serious or substantial.
You may look at it,
replied the girl, offering me the book. Oh, I did so. A brief examination convinced me that the contents were less taking than the title. Rasselas looked dull to my trifling taste. I saw nothing about fairies, nothing about genii. No bright varieties seemed spread over the closely printed pages. I returned it to her. She received it quietly, and without saying anything, she was about to relapse into her former studious mood. Again, I ventured to disturb her.
"Can you tell me what the writing on that stone over the door means? What is Lowood Institution?"
This house, where you are come to live.
"And why do they call it institution? Is it in any way different from other schools?"
It is partly a charity school. You and I and the rest of us are charity children. I suppose you are an orphan. Are not either your father or your mother dead?
"Both died before I can remember."
Well, all the girls here have lost either one or both parents, and this is called an institution for educating orphans.
"Do we pay no money? Do they keep us for nothing?"
We pay, or our friends pay, £15 a year for each.
"Then why do they call us charity children?"
Because £15 is not enough for board and teaching, and the deficiency is supplied by subscription.
"Who subscribes?"
Different benevolent-minded ladies and gentlemen in this neighborhood and in London.
"Who was Naomi Brocklehurst?"
The lady who built the new part of this house, as that tablet records, and whose son overlooks and directs everything here.
"Why?"
Because he is treasurer and manager of the establishment.
"Then this house does not belong to that tall lady who wears a watch and who said we would have some bread and cheese?"
To Miss Temple? Oh, no, I wish it did. She has to answer to Mr. Brocklehurst for all she does. Mr. Brocklehurst buys all our food and all our clothes.
"Does he live here?"
No, it's 2 miles off at a large hall.
"Is he a good man?"
He is a clergyman and is said to do a great deal of good.
"Did you say that tall lady was called Miss Temple?"
Yes.
"And what are the other teachers called?"
The one with red cheeks is called Miss Smith. She attends to the work and cuts out for we make our own clothes, our frocks and pelisses and everything. The little one with black hair is Miss Scatcherd. She teaches history and grammar. And here's the second class repetitions. And the one who wears a shawl and has a pocket handkerchief tied to her side with a yellow ribbon is Madame Poirat. She comes from Lille in France and teaches French.
Do you like the teachers?
Well enough.
Do you like the little black one and the Madame, I cannot pronounce her name as you do.
But Miss Scatcherd is hasty. You must take care not to offend her. Madame Poirat is not a bad sort of person.
But Miss Temple is the best, isn't she?
Miss Temple is very good and very clever. She is above the rest because she knows far more than they do.
Have you been long here?
2 years.
Are you an orphan?
My mother is dead.
Are you happy here?
You ask rather too many questions. I have given you answers enough for the present. Now I want to read.
But at that moment, the summons sounded for dinner. All re-entered the house. The odour which now filled the refectory was scarcely more appetizing than that which had regaled our nostrils at breakfast. The dinner was served in 2 huge tin-plated vessels, whence rose a steam redolent of rancid fat. I found the mess to consist of indifferent potatoes and strange shreds of rusty meat, mixed and cooked together. Of this preparation, a tolerably abundant plateful was apportioned to each pupil. I ate what I could and wondered within myself whether every day's fare would be like this. After dinner, we immediately adjourned to the schoolroom. Lessons recommenced and were continued till 5 o'clock. The only marked event of the afternoon was that I saw the girl with whom I had conversed on the veranda dismissed in disgrace by Miss Scatcherd from a history class and sent to stand in the middle of the large schoolroom. The punishment seemed to me in high degree ignominious, especially for so great a girl. She looked 13 or upwards. I expected she would show signs of great distress or shame, but to my surprise, she neither wept nor blushed. Composed, though grave, she stood the central mark of all eyes.
How can she bear it so quietly, so firmly?
I asked of myself.
Were I in her place, it seems to me I should wish the earth to open and swallow me up. She looks as if she were thinking of something beyond her punishment, beyond her situation, of something not round her nor before her. I've heard of daydreams. Is she in a daydream now? Her eyes are fixed on the floor, but I'm sure they do not see it. Her sight seems turned in, gone down into her heart. She is looking at what she can remember, I believe, not at what is really present. I wonder what sort of girl she is, whether good or naughty.
Soon after 5 p.m., we had another meal, consisting of a small mug of coffee and a half slice of brown bread. I devoured my bread and drank my coffee with relish, but I should have been glad of as much more. I was still hungry. Half an hour's recreation succeeded, then study, then the glass of water and the piece of oatcake, prayers, and bed. Such was my first day at Lowood.
Yay, that is the end of our first session. Good job, everyone. And special shout out to Alice, because I realized that you have the most spoken words of anyone for our readathon. And I apologize for not working in a break for you and just kind of jumping in, but
no, that's fun. Great. I loved it.
Hopefully you have time to recover. I am seeing more of you later today and tomorrow and over the weekend. So thank you for those of you who are returning. Thank you for everyone. If this is your only chance reading with us, we really appreciate you. And I appreciate all of the hard work of our readers who are coming in and cold reading this with us. Those of you in the audience, if you have not had a chance yet to click on a link to our GoFundMe page, I will post it along with this video later. I'll go back and edit it. That link is available with our welcome video on YouTube. You can find us on Twitter at Bring Brontes Home, H-O-M, not an E at the end. And all of our mission statement, our goals about helping the Friends of the National Libraries and saving the Hanrisfield Library, all of that information is available on our GoFundMe page. So I wanted to take a few minutes, we'll say less than 15 minutes, because we do have another readathon session starting in half an hour. But let's take a little bit of time if you want to kind of talk about this and share any of your feelings, your reactions. Let's stay away from spoilers, because we do see characters who are going to die throughout the book. That's how books work, so let's not spoil that. But what do you all want to talk about? Does anyone want to start out?
It's interesting, like not remember. I don't know if I definitely watched the film as a kid, and I don't remember any of this, but reading this, how much later literature that I've read that has clearly pulled from this. And I know sort of what I'm remembering is themes of sort of grand houses and boarding schools, which you pick up in every English, every English institution is pretty much the same. I mean, I hear stories of my mum's day school that was not dissimilar to, some of the stories that she tells about Lowood, but like, it's just interesting listening to the story and her descriptions and everything, and thinking, oh, I see a bit of Secret Garden in this. I see a bit of Jane Austen in this. I see Harry Potter, and you pull all of these sort of little bits and pieces. You see little bits and pieces of things that you've read in it, and it's just like you can see how this is such a cornerstone of writing for what has come since.
And the Brontes themselves were very well read. They had access to a first folio, which probably still exists, but we don't know which first folio it was. So if anyone ever feels like doing some major treasure searching, it's probably is held in a library, and we just don't know which one they specifically read. But there's a lot of Shakespeare in here. There's references to Byron. They had their own family copy of Byron's poetry. And some of these things we're going to get to see brought home to the Bronte parsonage with the Hanrisfield Library. If you've been to the Bronte parsonage, you probably recognize some of their treasures that are referenced in these first chapters. One of my favorite things that I hadn't noticed until you all were reading this was the reference to a convolvulus flower. This is a magnet that I got at the Bronte parsonage several years ago. I also have this image tattooed on my leg, which I will not show you. We'll just look at the magnet. But this is something that Charlotte drew. And then she talks about a convolvulus in these chapters. So their lives were very much intertwined with this story. And that's why we really need to bring their treasures back home to the Bronte Parsonage Museum. Corey, I wanted to ask you about the song, because this was something that was assigned for Bessie, which was the character I was reading, to sing. And no one wanted to hear me sing. I knew that without asking anyone. So I texted you a couple of days ago to see if you would take on that role. And I appreciate you jumping in. So can you tell us about some of your choices in preparation with that song?
Yes, it was my pleasure to sing it, although I am always happy to listen to you sing, whether you think so or not. And I will say you were so gracious to send over some resources for me to use. So the melody for the first is the actual melody for the song from the time period. You found it for me, and I was able to look it up on YouTube and learn it. And then the second melody I chose was based on a hymn, the name of which is completely escaping me because it sounds similar to another song. But I figured hymns were so universally known and are often used for lots of different texts that would be a good choice and something she most likely would have been familiar with in the time period.
That's really great. And if any of you watching are more interested in Bronte music, there are some videos on YouTube of a performer whose name I do not know offhand, playing the piano in the Bronte Parsonage Museum that the sisters would have played. And some of the songs that I sent to Corey were from a book that was a reproduction of Anne Bronte's songbook and Branwell's flute book that I just bought on eBay many years ago. It was published in 1999. and that's a really fun resource as well. So does anyone want to share their emotional reactions to this, or perhaps guess about what may happen, or just say anything about your experience with Jane Eyre in the past?
I will say I have read Jane Eyre before, but many years ago. So it feels a bit like discovering it again for the first time, and discovering it while living along with like 10-year-old Jane has been really thrilling, but also very sad because she has such a difficult start. But I also find it so fascinating how much she develops as a character in just the first 5 chapters, and how much freedom she finds, and how you discuss. She goes from a very shy, quiet, just like defeated child who, and then you have glimpses into things she's interested in, but then starts becoming more curious and engaging with people and finding that she is not as entirely bereft and alone as she thinks, even if she isn't able to develop those relationships as much as she could. But I'm so excited to see how she continues to grow and expand over the course of the whole novel, because of course she is the titular character, so we know we're going to get to see so much of her and her journey.
And it's so fantastic, just her character arc with her interactions with Mrs. Reed in these first chapters. And you all, Rachel and Corey, did such a great job with that exchange. You scared my cat. I had a cat nearby and he took off scrambling. So that was a very good use of your emotions. I do love too how Jane Eyre changes with you as you read and as you grow older. I read it for the first time as a teenager, and now I'm the mother of a 10-year-old, and some of the stuff that Jane goes through as a child is heartbreaking in a different kind of profound way than when you read it before you've experienced parenthood. So it's such a strong novel. It's such a great opening to, if anyone is studying creative writing, this is the perfect example of starting late. It kind of thrusts us into Jane's world without really knowing the exposition, without really knowing what's going on. And then we get that exposition and character development as the chapters progress. And it's a kind of study we can do that even after 150, almost 200 years, it still applies to all of the creative writing that we see in television series and movies. Is there anything else that anyone would like to add? We're having a really sweet chat, I should say, in the Zoom chat. All of the performers are being really kind and complimentary to each other, and I appreciate that. You all did a great job. You're a great group.
Has your teenager read it yet? I know you have a teenager in your house.
Yes, so she was scheduled to read Jane Eyre. It is a required reading for 7th grade at her school. She just wrapped up 7th grade, but because it was virtual school, they could not get access to their physical textbooks. And the teachers, because of virtual learning, let the kids choose whatever novels they wanted to read. So she chose not to read Jane Eyre, in part because her mom thinks it's pretty cool, and that therefore lowers it on the coolness scale for her. But next year's 7th graders will get to read it. She's just the 1 year that skipped it, unfortunately.
Can we peer pressure her into reading it?
You're welcome to. I really want her to read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is part of how Carolina and I have bonded in the past over our love of Anne. And I do think The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Yes, Team Anne. I do think The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is a great follow-up to Jane Eyre. And if some of you who are watching this have not read it, but want like a follow-up to Jane Eyre, it's not the same story, but it's the same universe. It has a lot of the same tone and themes, and I highly recommend it. I'm pressuring my daughter to read Jane Eyre just so she can follow it up with the Team Anne Tenant of Wildfell Hall novel. Is there anything else you all would like to say? Or we've read for a very long time. Yes,
Yeah,
Rachel.
I would just like to say thank you to everyone. I really actually enjoyed doing it as though it was a script, you know, and it's so different when you hear different voices and hear different emotions in it rather than just you know, a dialogue between yourself and the pages of a book. It's very, very different. And there were quite a lot of things that jumped out at me in terms of numbers, colours, names, places, quite a lot of symbolism. And I kept writing notes, like going, I know this book, but I didn't know that. You know, there are quite a lot of things that came out at me. So yeah, I think that came through from the process of doing it in this format. So yeah, really well done, everyone. So enjoyable.
This was really great. And I came into this thinking about something Jane says in a later chapter. She explains to another character that she was trying to draw pictures, and she expresses her frustration that the pictures that she sees in her head are not as good as the ones that her hand produces. And I was thinking that about myself coming in here. Like, there's no way I can sound the way that Bessie does in my head. And I do really think that we made a pretty good picture, all of us together. And hopefully we've created some images in our viewers' heads of what this novel can sound like after it's existed for more than 150 years. So again, another reminder, everyone, please help contribute however you can, whether it's sharing this on social media, telling your friends and family, contributing money if you have that available. Please help spread the word about our GoFundMe campaign for Bring the Brontes Home, and also for the Friends of the National Libraries to earn their £15 million to bring the treasures of the Brontes and so many other 19th century authors to museums where they can be on public display for visitors and for scholars for the indefinite future. I really appreciate everyone. If any of you want to have a final word, now is your chance. So anything else?
Sure. This is my absolute first exposure to the novel, and it was a delight. I loved it. I loved hearing it. I loved everybody's, just everyone's the reading. Alice, I applaud your vocal strength. Wow. I did want to. There was something that Amber, you said about your, I think one of your daughters, that like it was the 7th grade and they got to pick their own book, so they didn't pick Jane Eyre. Or she didn't pick Jane Eyre. And I remember, like, when I got the opportunity to pick my own books to read, I always went with like super dark utopian things. And I remember one of them that I read was Brave New World. And I even there was even parts in Brave New World where they're talking about the class structure and sort of like, oh, like these people don't want to be with these people and these people don't want to be with these people. That was also right in Jane Eyre, when she was talking about like, oh, I don't want to be poor because the poor are this. And it was like, even that, like in what I would have originally assumed to be an entirely unrelated, two entirely unrelated subjects, that still pops back in. It was like, oh, that just jumped out at me. It's super cool. So thank you for asking me to be a part of this.
Oh, thank you for joining us. And it is wonderful how much literature intertwines. I mean, Brave New World gets its title from Shakespeare even. And we do see, if you are new to Jane Eyre and this is your first experience, you will see some things where you kind of say, oh, well, that's where that expression came from, like plain Jane. That very much relates to this novel. And there are some allusions to other books that you may have read or have experienced as you also go through Jane. If you think you know this novel, like Rachel said, you're going to find stuff in it that you just were unaware of, like my convolvulus reference, that even though I've read this novel like 10 times or something in the past month, I didn't catch that until I heard the words come out of Alice's mouth. So everyone, thank you so much. This particular group is representing 3 continents, and I do look forward to seeing you all later. Audience members, thank you so much for joining us. If you're watching this after the fact, you can go ahead and probably start binging our next video now. Otherwise, I'm about to jump from this Zoom room into our next live stream, and we'll start streaming live again momentarily. So thank you, everyone. I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to end the live stream. But I think I'm just going to end the meeting, everyone, who I'm still doing this as if I'm not technologically inclined. So I'm going to end this meeting. If you're joining me again, I'm going to start a new one. And thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you around.